Wyoming Territory, 1876. A woman steps down from a weathered stagecoach into the harsh light of an unforgiving afternoon. Her gloved hand clutches a weathered letter bearing the promise of a new life. In her pocket, a daguerreotype of the man she traveled 800 miles to marry. Her eyes scan the faces of the handful of townsfolk who've gathered, searching for the one that matches the image she carries. But fate had other designs. What awaits her is not the prosperous ranch and hopeful husband she was promised, but ashes, deception, and an unexpected offer from a man sworn to uphold the law in a lawless land. Her journey west was meant to be an end, but it would prove to be just the beginning. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Whispering Pines as the twice-weekly stagecoach from Cheyenne rolled to a dusty halt outside the Frontier Inn. The spring air carried the scent of pine and promise, though neither could quite mask the underlying tension that had gripped the small settlement since the raid 3 weeks prior. Josephine Blackwell gathered her skirts and prepared to disembark, her heart hammering against her ribs with a mixture of exhaustion and anticipation. 10 days of travel had left her body weary, but her spirit resolute. At 25 years old, with auburn hair pinned sensibly beneath a modest hat and hazel eyes that reflected both intelligence and determination, she carried herself with the poise of a woman who knew her own mind, despite the uncertainties that lay ahead. "Whispering Pines," announced the driver, a grizzled man named Harlan, who'd maintained a stoic silence for most of the journey, speaking only to point out landmarks or warn of particularly treacherous stretches of road. "End of the line for you, miss?" Josephine nodded, accepting his calloused hand as she stepped down onto Wyoming soil for the first time. Her traveling dress, a practical gray wool that had once been considered stylish in Boston, now seemed hopelessly out of place amid the rugged simplicity of the frontier town. She smoothed its wrinkles automatically, a habit born of proper upbringing. Rather than vanity, the town was little more than a single dirt road lined with rough-hewn buildings. A general store, the small inn where the stage had stopped, a livery stable, and what appeared to be a saloon made up the heart of the settlement. Beyond these, perhaps 24 small houses and cabins stretched toward the surrounding pine forest. A handwritten sign nailed to a post announced a population of 184, though that number seemed optimistic at first glance. Josephine's gaze swept the small crowd that had gathered to witness the stagecoach's arrival, searching for the face she'd come to know only through a small photograph and 18 months of correspondence. "Mr. Daniel Morgan," she inquired of the driver as her trunk and 2 valises were unloaded. "He was to meet me here today." Harlan spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "Don't know no Morgan," he said, then added more kindly, seeing her expression falter. "But Sheriff Hayes might, or Ida Wheeler at the general store. They keep track of most folks around these parts." A flicker of unease passed through Josephine, but she quickly suppressed it. After nearly 2 years of corresponding, she had traveled across the country to join Daniel Morgan, whose letters had described a promising cattle ranch 15 miles outside of Whispering Pines. His most recent letter had explicitly stated he would meet her stagecoach on this very day. As the driver climbed back to his seat, eager to reach the next settlement before nightfall, Josephine found herself standing alone with her possessions in the center of a town where she knew no one. Within moments, the stagecoach was disappearing around the bend, the sound of hooves and wheels fading into the distance. "Need some help, Mom?" A boy of perhaps 13 approached, eyeing her luggage with enterprising interest. "Yes, thank you," Josephine replied, managing a small smile. "Is there somewhere I might wait while my trunk is delivered to the Morgan Ranch? I'm expected to be there today." She reached into her reticule and withdrew a coin that brought an immediate grin to the boy's freckled face. "Morgan Ranch?" The boy's expression shifted to one of confusion. "Don't know about no Morgan Ranch." The unease that had been simmering beneath Josephine's composed exterior began to rise. "Mr. Daniel Morgan. He raises cattle about 15 miles north of town, according to his letters." The boy shook his head. "Only cattle spread north of here belongs to old man Hollister, and raiders hit it hard last month. Burned most of it to the ground." Josephine felt the blood drain from her face. "There must be some mistake. I've been corresponding with Mr. Morgan for over a year and a half. He described his property in great detail." "You could ask Sheriff Hayes," the boy suggested, already lifting one of her smaller bags. "He knows everybody round these parts." The sheriff's office was a modest building with a freshly painted sign and a hitching post out front, where a magnificent black stallion stood, evidence that its owner took his position seriously. Inside, Sheriff Matthew Hayes looked up from his desk, setting aside a stack of wanted posters as Josephine entered. At 35, Hayes cut an imposing figure, tall and broad-shouldered with intelligent blue eyes that seemed to take in everything at a glance. His dark hair was cut short beneath a wide-brimmed hat, and the badge pinned to his vest gleamed in the afternoon light streaming through the windows. A holstered Colt revolver hung at his hip, worn smooth from years of use. "Something I can help." "You with, ma'am?" he asked, rising to his feet with unexpected grace for a man of his size. "I hope so, Sheriff. I'm looking for Daniel Morgan. I was to meet him today upon my arrival." Josephine tried to keep her voice steady, but a tremor of worry had begun to creep in. The sheriff's expression shifted subtly, a faint narrowing of his eyes that did nothing to calm her growing apprehension. "And you are?" "Josephine Blackwell. Mr. Morgan and I have been corresponding for the past 18 months. I've come from Boston to—" She hesitated, then straightened her shoulders. "To be his wife." Hayes removed his hat, a gesture that immediately confirmed her fears. "Miss Blackwell, I'm afraid there's no Daniel Morgan in Whispering Pines or the surrounding territory. Not now, and not in the 3 years I've served as sheriff." The words struck Josephine with physical force, and she reached for the back of a nearby chair to steady herself. "That's impossible. I have his letters." She opened her reticule with trembling fingers, withdrawing a packet of correspondence, each envelope bearing the same neat handwriting. "Daniel Morgan, Evergreen Ranch, Whispering Pines, Wyoming Territory." Hayes examined the envelopes, his frown deepening as he studied the postmarks. "The handwriting is educated. I'll give you that," he said after a moment. "But I'm sorry to say, you've been deceived, ma'am. But why would anyone—" Josephine couldn't complete the question, the implication too painful to articulate. The sheriff sighed, returning the letters. "It happens more than folks talk about. Some men write to Eastern women, spinning tales about prosperous ranches and comfortable lives. They take whatever money the women send for travel expenses, maybe keep up the correspondence long enough to request funds for wedding preparations or business ventures, then disappear." Josephine sank into the chair, her mind racing through the events of the past 18 months. She had been cautious, so cautious. She had insisted on corresponding for a full year before agreeing to travel west. Morgan's letters had been consistent, detailed, and seemingly sincere. He had never directly asked for money, though she had sent funds to cover wedding preparations 3 months ago at his request. "Was there a Hollister ranch that was raided?" she asked finally, grasping at the one thread that might connect her phantom fiancé to reality. "Yes, ma'am. James Hollister's place about 15 miles north. Raiders hit it 3 weeks ago, burned the main house and most of the outbuildings. Hollister and his foreman were killed trying to defend it. The rest of the hands scattered." Hayes watched her carefully. "The description matches what you might have been told about the Morgan place." "I see." Josephine's voice sounded distant to her own ears. Miss Blackwell, the Frontier Inn has clean rooms at reasonable rates. I'd suggest you take a day or two to consider your options before the next eastbound stage on Thursday. The implication was clear. Return to Boston, admit defeat, accept that she had been duped by a confidence man who had preyed on her vulnerability and loneliness after her father's death. Thank you, Sheriff. I'll consider it. Her voice was steady, belying the turmoil within. Outside, the afternoon sun had begun its descent, painting whispering pines in golden hues that couldn't disguise its roughness. Nothing like Boston with its cobblestone streets and proper society. Josephine made her way to the Frontier Inn, arranging for a room and the storage of her trunk. $2 secured her a small but clean chamber with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a window overlooking the town's main street. Once alone, she finally allowed herself to absorb the magnitude of her situation. Daniel Morgan didn't exist. The ranch she had described in such loving detail was fictional, or based on a property that now lay in ashes. The 18 months of correspondence, the plans, the hopes, all built on falsehood. Half of her modest inheritance was spent on the journey west, and now she was stranded in a frontier town where she knew no one. She unfolded Morgan's last letter, reading it again by the fading light. My dearest Josephine, as I write this, spring has finally come to Evergreen Ranch. The new calves are finding their legs, and the meadows are turning green after winter's long sleep. I've completed the improvements to the main house, including the bookshelves in the sitting room I promised you. The bedroom faces east, as you requested, to catch the morning light you so cherish. I count the days until April 15th, when I will finally meet you at the stagecoach. Look for a man in a dark hat with a silver band. I'll be the one with the most genuine smile, as I'll finally be welcoming home the woman whose letters have brought such joy to my solitary life. Until then, I remain faithfully yours, Daniel. The details were so specific, so seemingly heartfelt. How could someone fabricate such sincerity? And more practically, what was she to do now? Returning to Boston was the obvious answer, but the thought filled her with dread. She had sold her father's modest house, settled his affairs after his death, and departed with no intention of returning. Boston held nothing but painful memories of her father's final illness and the relentless pressure from his former business partner, William Hargrove, who had made it clear that marrying him was her only path to security. What Hargrove didn't know, what no one knew, was that Jonathan Blackwell had secretly transferred ownership of his small but profitable publishing business to his daughter before his death. The business that Hargrove assumed would come to him through marriage or default was legally Josephine's, along with the modest funds her father had withdrawn from the bank in his final weeks. I won't have him forcing your hand through financial necessity, her father had whispered from his deathbed. This gives you freedom to choose. Josephine had chosen freedom in the West, a fresh start with a man who seemed to value her mind as well as her potential as a wife. Now that dream had evaporated like morning mist, leaving her adrift in a strange and dangerous territory. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. It was the innkeeper's wife, a plump woman with kind eyes who introduced herself as Mary Wilson. Thought, "You might like some supper, Miss Blackwell," she said, presenting a tray of simple but appetizing food. Roast beef, potatoes, fresh bread, and a slice of apple pie. "We serve meals downstairs, but I figured you might prefer privacy after your long journey." "That's very thoughtful. Thank you." Josephine accepted the tray gratefully. Mary lingered in the doorway. "Sheriff Hayes mentioned your situation. I'm real sorry about that. Some men ain't got the decency God gave a rattlesnake." "It seems not." Josephine managed a small, tight smile. "If you're thinking of heading back east, stage fare's $12 to Cheyenne, then there's the train from there." $12. a substantial sum, though well within her means thanks to her father's foresight. But returning meant facing William Hargrove, meant admitting defeat, meant surrendering the independence she had fought so hard to secure. And if I weren't heading east, Josephine asked carefully. Mary considered this. Well, Whispering Pines is growing. We get the mining trade from up north and the cattle business from the south. Town needs all sorts of services. I have some experience with bookkeeping and publishing, Josephine offered. Her father had insisted she understand every aspect of his business, unusual as that was for a woman. That's something. Might talk to Ben Wilson, my husband, who runs the Territorial Gazette. It's just a small paper, but he's always complaining about the accounts and business side of things. Josephine nodded, considering this new possibility. I'll do that. Thank you. After Mary left, Josephine ate mechanically, her mind racing with possibilities. She had planned to keep her inheritance and business ownership secret to ensure Daniel Morgan wanted her for herself rather than her assets. Now that deception seemed prescient rather than unnecessary. If she stayed, she could potentially establish herself independently. But how long before word reached Boston, and William Hargrove came looking for what he believed was rightfully his? Josephine stepped to the window, gazing out at Whispering Pines as darkness fell. Lanterns were being lit along the main street, casting pools of golden light. The town was smaller than she had imagined, rougher, but there was something appealing in its straightforward nature. No pretense, no stifling social rules to navigate. A figure caught her attention, Sheriff Hayes, making his evening rounds. He moved with the quiet confidence of a man accustomed to authority, nodding to townspeople as he passed. There was something reassuring about his presence, a sense of order amid the chaotic turn her life had taken. As she watched him disappear down the street, a decision began to form in Josephine's mind. She would not run back to Boston in defeat. She would not surrender the independence she had traveled so far to claim. Somehow, she would forge a new path here in Wyoming territory, even if it meant starting with nothing but her wits and determination. The following morning, Josephine had just finished a simple breakfast in the inn's dining room when Sheriff Hayes appeared at her table, his expression serious. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Miss Blackwell, may I speak with you privately? He asked, removing his hat. Of course, she replied, a flutter of apprehension rising in her chest. Hayes led her to a quiet corner of the room. I've been giving your situation some thought, he said, and I may have found a temporary solution if you're interested. I'm listening. Josephine met his gaze steadily. I have a cabin about 5 miles outside of town, up in the foothills. Simple place, but sound. I rarely use it these days, since my duties keep me in town most nights. He paused. You'd be welcome to stay there while you decide on your next steps. Might give you some breathing room to consider your options without spending your savings. On room and board, the unexpected offer caught Josephine by surprise. That's very generous, Sheriff, but I couldn't possibly— It's sitting empty, he interrupted gently, and I'd rest easier knowing it was occupied and cared for. Whispering Pines isn't Boston, Miss Blackwell. Out here, neighbors help neighbors, even new ones. Josephine studied him, trying to discern his motives. There was nothing in his clear blue eyes but genuine concern and perhaps a touch of respect for the dignity with which she was facing her predicament. Why would you help me? She asked finally. You don't know me. Hayes considered her question seriously. I've seen too many people broken by this territory, men and women both. The ones who survive are those who face hardship with courage and adapt to circumstances rather than being crushed by them. He offered a small smile. You strike me as a survivor, Miss Blackwell. I'd like to give you a fair chance to prove me right. In that moment, on the heels of deception and disappointment, his straightforward honesty was like a lifeline. Josephine found herself nodding before she'd fully processed the implications of accepting his offer. "Thank you, Sheriff Hayes. I accept." The journey to Sheriff Hayes's cabin took them through rolling foothills that gradually rose toward the distant mountains. Spring had turned the landscape vibrant with wildflowers and fresh grass, though Josephine noted the lingering patches of snow in shadowed ravines, a reminder that Wyoming's beauty came with harsh realities. Hayes drove the wagon himself, pointing out landmarks as they traveled, a natural spring that never failed even in drought years, a stand of aspens that turned brilliant gold in autumn, the distant peaks where bighorn sheep could sometimes be spotted from the valley floor. "That ridge there marks the boundary of what locals call Hayes Territory," he said, with a self-deprecating smile. "Not official, of course, but folks started calling it that after I tracked the Hudson gang through a blizzard 3 winters back." "You pursued outlaws alone in a blizzard?" Josephine asked, unable to hide her surprise. "Had no choice. They'd robbed the Whispering Pines Bank and shot the teller. Caught up with them about 2 miles beyond that ridge." His expression darkened briefly. "Only one survived to stand trial." The casual mention of such danger reminded Josephine how different this world was from Boston society. Here, law and civilization hung by the thinnest of threads, maintained by men like Hayes, who stood between ordinary citizens and the chaos of the frontier. They crested a small rise, and the cabin came into view. It sat on a gentle slope overlooking a small valley, backed by pines that would shelter it from winter winds. The structure was modest, but solidly built of hand-hewn logs, with a stone chimney. A covered porch stretched across the front, and a small barn stood nearby with a corral attached. "It's not much," Hayes said as he brought the wagon to a halt, "but it's weather-tight and defensible." "Defensible?" Josephine echoed. Hayes nodded toward the cabin's windows. Gun ports disguised in the shutters, clear sightlines in all directions. Previous owner was cautious. He stepped down from the wagon and offered her his hand. "After what happened at the Hollister place, you might appreciate those features." The interior of the cabin was spare but surprisingly comfortable. A main room with a stone fireplace dominated the space, with a small kitchen area to one side. A door led to what Hayes explained was the bedroom, and a ladder provided access to a loft space above. "Furniture's simple but solid," he said, gesturing to the wooden table, chairs, and a bookshelf that contained several dozen volumes, an unexpected luxury in such a remote location. "Water comes from the spring behind the cabin. Outhouse is around the back. Barn has room for a horse if you decide you need one." Josephine moved to the window, taking in the sweeping view of the valley below. Despite the cabin's isolation, she felt an unexpected sense of peace rather than fear. "It's beautiful," she said softly. "Gets in your blood," Hayes agreed. "This territory, hard as it is sometimes." He began bringing in her trunk and valises while Josephine explored the cabin more thoroughly. The bedroom contained a simple bed frame with a straw mattress, a chest of drawers, and a small table with a basin for washing. Everything was clean, if somewhat dusty from disuse. In the kitchen area, she found basic provisions: flour, coffee, sugar, salt, and some dried beans. A cast-iron stove, well blackened from use, stood ready for cooking. On a shelf nearby, she discovered a shotgun with a box of shells. "That stays here," Hayes said, noticing her discovery. "Winchester model 1866. Simple to load, minimal recoil. I'll show you how to use it before I leave." "Sheriff Hayes, I've never fired a weapon in my life," Josephine protested. "Then it's high time you learned." His tone brooked no argument. "Woman alone needs to be able to defend herself, especially out here." Once her belongings were settled, Hayes took her outside and patiently demonstrated how to load, aim, and fire the shotgun. The weapon's kick caught her by surprise, but by the third shot, Josephine was hitting the pine cone target he'd set up at 20 paces. "Good," he said with approval. Practice every day. Just one shot, ammunition expensive. As the afternoon waned, Hayes prepared to depart. "I check the trails this way twice a week," he explained. "I'll stop by whenever I'm passing. The Whitaker family has a homestead about 2 miles east. Good people if you need help when I'm not available." "Sheriff Hayes," Josephine said as he climbed into his wagon, "I don't know how to thank you for your kindness." "Matthew," he corrected. "Out here, sheriff is for town business, and no thanks needed. Just be careful." With that, he flicked the yo. Reins and the wagon rolled away, leaving Josephine truly alone for the first time since her arrival in Wyoming Territory. That first night in the cabin was a test of courage. Every creak and rustle from the surrounding forest set her nerves on edge. The shotgun rested beside her bed, a comforting presence despite her lingering discomfort with firearms. Sleep came in fitful bursts, broken by strange animal calls and the unfamiliar sound of wind through pines. Morning brought renewed determination. Josephine rose with the first light, washed in the icy water from the spring, and set about making the cabin more habitable. She swept floors, washed windows, and aired bedding in the bright sunshine. Physical labor helped clear her mind, allowing her to consider her situation more objectively. The Daniel Morgan deception still stung, but anger had begun to replace shock. Someone had deliberately exploited her vulnerability, stolen her money, and nearly left her destitute in a strange territory. Yet through that cruel manipulation, she had found herself in this peaceful place with an unexpected chance to chart her own course. As she worked through the small garden plot beside the cabin, clearing winter debris and turning the soil for planting, Josephine began to formulate a plan. She would give herself 1 month in this sanctuary, time to consider options without financial pressure. Perhaps Ben Wilson at the Territorial Gazette would indeed need her bookkeeping skills. Or she might find another way to use her publishing knowledge. By sunset, she had transformed the cabin's interior from merely habitable to genuinely welcoming. Fresh pine boughs in a crockery jug brightened the table. Her mother's lace doilies, brought all the way from Boston as sentimental treasures, now adorned the rough furniture, creating an incongruous but pleasing blend of frontier practicality and Eastern refinement. Exhausted but satisfied, Josephine settled into the cabin's single rocking chair with one of the books from the shelf, a volume of Emerson's essays that showed signs of careful reading, with passages underlined and margins filled with neat annotations. The previous reader's thoughtful engagement with the text came as a surprise. She had not expected to find such literary appreciation in this remote place. The next 4 days passed in a similar fashion. Josephine established routines, familiarized herself with the cabin's quirks, and even practiced with the shotgun, as Hayes had instructed. She walked the surrounding area, identifying edible plants from a reference book she found on the shelf, and gathering what she could to supplement her stored provisions. On the 5th day, as she was hanging freshly washed linens to dry in the spring sunshine, the sound of approaching hoofbeats brought her hand instinctively to the shotgun propped against the cabin wall. She relaxed slightly when she recognized Sheriff Hayes's tall figure on horseback. "You're looking settled," he observed as he dismounted, taking in the drying laundry and the newly tended garden. "Place hasn't looked this good in years." "It feels more like home already," she admitted, surprising herself with the realization. "Though I've noticed the roof leaks near the chimney when it rains," Hayes nodded. "Meant to fix that last fall. Shingles are in the barn if you're of a mind to try your hand at it." "I've never repaired a roof before," Josephine said dubiously. "But I suppose there's a first time for everything out here." Something like approval flickered in Hayes's eyes. "That's the spirit that tames territories, Miss Blackwell." "Josephine," she corrected with a small smile. "If you're Matthew outside of town business, then I'm Josephine." He had brought supplies from town: coffee, sugar, flour, and 2 newspapers, the latest edition of the Territorial Gazette, and, surprisingly, a month-old copy of the Boston Herald. "Thought you might want news from back east," he explained. "Stagecoach. Brought it yesterday." The thoughtfulness of this gesture touched her more deeply than she cared to admit. While Hayes watered his horse, Josephine prepared coffee and set out some fresh-baked biscuits she'd made that morning. "I have questions," she said, when they were seated at the small table, "about the raiders who attacked the Hollister ranch." Hayes's expression grew serious. "Why do you want to know about that?" "Because whoever created the fiction of Daniel Morgan likely based it on the Hollister property. I want to understand what happened." He studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Fair enough. The attack came 3 weeks ago, probably the Blackwell gang." "Blackwell?" Josephine interrupted, startled at hearing her own surname. "Isaiah Blackwell. No relation to you, I'd wager. He and his men have been raiding isolated ranches from here to the Dakota Territory. They hit at night, usually. Kill the men, steal the livestock, burn the buildings. Sometimes they take women, sometimes they don't." His voice was matter-of-fact, but Josephine didn't miss the tightening of his jaw. "Hollister and his foreman fought back, paid for it with their lives. And no one's caught these men? Not for lack of trying. Territory's vast, and they know the Badlands better than most. Territorial governors authorized a special marshal to track them down, but so far no luck." "A special marshal? Federal appointment? More authority than a local sheriff. Can cross territorial boundaries." Hayes sipped his coffee. "Fellow named Nathaniel Reed. Used to scout for the army. Good man in a fight, from what I hear." Josephine absorbed this information, trying to reconcile the peaceful setting around her with the violence that had occurred so nearby. "Do you think they might return to this area?" "Hard to say. They've never hit the same region twice in a row before." Hayes met her gaze directly. "But that's why I insisted on teaching you to use that shotgun." The conversation shifted to lighter topics. Local history, the personalities of Whispering Pines, the prospects for the coming summer. Hayes proved to be an engaging storyteller once he warmed to his subject, painting vivid pictures of the territory's early days and the characters who had shaped it. As he prepared to leave, Josephine walked with him to his horse. "I've been thinking of riding into town tomorrow," she said, "to speak with Mr. Wilson about possible work at the Gazette." Hayes nodded approvingly. "Good idea. I'd offer to escort you, but I'm riding south to investigate reports of cattle rustling." "I can manage," Josephine assured him. "If you could just point out the safest trail." He described the route carefully, recommending landmarks to watch for, and suggesting she borrow the old mare in the barn. "She's gentle but sure-footed, perfect for a novice rider." After Hayes departed, Josephine spent the remainder of the day preparing for her journey into town. She located a side saddle in the barn that, while dusty, appeared serviceable. The fey mare, whom she decided to call Penny for her copper-colored coat, seemed amenable to human company after an initial wariness. That evening, Josephine finally opened the Boston Herald that Hayes had brought. She skimmed the familiar columns with a strange sense of detachment, as if the city described was one she had visited long ago rather than the place she had called home her entire life. A small notice on the 3rd page caught her eye and sent a chill through her body. "Missing heiress sought information is requested regarding the whereabouts of Miss Josephine Blackwell, daughter of the late Jonathan Blackwell, who departed Boston on March 30th, headed for Wyoming Territory. Miss Blackwell is believed to be in possession of certain business documents improperly removed from her father's estate. A generous reward is offered for information leading to her return. Contact William Hargrove, Esquire, at the address below." Her hands trembled as she reread the notice. Hargrove had discovered her father's secret transfer of the business and was now portraying her as a thief. The generous reward meant bounty hunters and fortune-seekers might soon be looking for her. Her quiet sanctuary suddenly seemed far less secure. Josephine rose from her chair and began to pace the small cabin. She needed to think carefully about her next move. Warning Hayes seemed prudent. He should know that trouble might be coming to his territory. But revealing her full situation required a level of trust she wasn't yet ready to extend, even to someone who had shown her such kindness. The decision to ride into town the next day took on new urgency. She needed information about stage schedules and mail service. Perhaps she could send a letter to her father's lawyer in New York, requesting help in countering Hargrove's claims. She would also need to secure her position here more permanently if she intended to stay. Morning dawned clear and cool. Josephine dressed with care in her most practical riding skirt and jacket. She braided her hair tightly and donned a wide-brimmed hat to protect against the spring sun. The shotgun, broken down as Hayes had shown her, fitted into a leather scabbard attached to the saddle. Penny proved as gentle as promised, allowing Josephine to mount with only minimal difficulty despite her limited riding experience. The trail to town followed a small creek for much of the way, making navigation simpler than she had feared. As the trail rounded a bend about halfway to town, Josephine reined Penny to a halt. Ahead, on the far bank of the creek, 3 riders had stopped to water their horses. Something about their appearance, the way they sat their mounts, the rifles prominently displayed in saddle scabbards, raised her instinctive caution. She was about to turn Penny around when one of the men looked up and spotted her. He nudged his companions and pointed in her direction. All 3 began to move their horses across the shallow creek toward her position. Josephine's heart hammered in her chest. They might be perfectly innocent travelers, but something in their deliberate approach triggered warning bells. Hayes' words echoed in her mind. Woman alone needs to be able to defend herself, especially out here. She could try to outrun them, but Penny was no match for their more powerful mounts. Fighting was out of the question. 3 armed men against 1 novice with a shotgun. That left only one option: the dense forest that climbed the hillside to her right. If she could reach the trees, she might lose them in the undergrowth. Without hesitation, Josephine turned Penny toward the hillside and urged her forward. The mare responded with surprising speed, perhaps sensing her rider's fear. Behind her, Josephine heard shouts and the splash of horses crossing the creek. The trees loomed ahead, offering a tantalizing promise of concealment. 50 yards. 40. 30. A shot rang out, the bullet splintering bark from a tree beside her. Not innocent travelers, then. Josephine bent low over Penny's neck, making herself a smaller target as the mare plunged into the protective shadows of the pine forest. The underbrush was thicker than she had anticipated, forcing her to slow Penny's pace. She could hear her pursuers crashing through the woods behind her, their horses more powerful but less adept at navigating the close-growing trees. If she could maintain distance and find somewhere to hide, the forest floor suddenly dropped away in a steep ravine. Penny slid to a halt at the edge, nearly unseating Josephine. The mare snorted nervously, clearly unwilling to attempt the descent. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit grew closer. Josephine quickly dismounted and slapped Penny's flank, sending the horse galloping along the edge of the ravine. With luck, her pursuers would follow the more obvious trail of the horse while she found another way forward. She scrambled down the side of the ravine, using tree roots and rocks as handholds. The descent was treacherous, loose soil giving way under her boots, but fear lent her agility she hadn't known she possessed. Reaching the bottom, she found herself in a narrow streambed with steep walls rising on either side. The sound of horses above told her the men had reached the ravine's edge. Josephine pressed herself against the earthen wall, trying to control her ragged breathing. Voices drifted down to her hiding place. Where'd she go? Horse went that way. Could be a trick. Check the ravine. Footsteps approached the edge directly, above her position. Josephine remained frozen, scarcely daring to breathe. A shower of loose pebbles cascaded down as someone peered over. Can't see nothing. Too steep to ride down. Woman wouldn't risk it. Hargrove said she's got grit. Might surprise you. The name confirmed her worst fears. These weren't random bandits. They were bounty hunters sent by William Hargrove. Either way, she's headed deeper into Hayes territory. Not worth tangling with him over. Rewards $500. I'd tangle with the devil himself for that kind of money. Yeah, well, Hayes ain't the devil, but he sent men to meet him. Come on. We'll catch her further along. She's got to come out somewhere. The footsteps retreated. Josephine remained, motionless for several more minutes, ensuring they were truly gone before allowing herself to consider her situation. She was on foot in unfamiliar wilderness, being hunted by men who knew the territory far better than she did. Her only advantage was their assumption that she would take predictable routes. The stream bed offered a path that wouldn't leave obvious tracks. Water, at least, wouldn't be a concern as long as she followed it. But which direction should she go? Back toward the cabin seemed risky. They might have seen her departure and could be watching for her return. Toward town meant potential witnesses and safety, but also exposure in open country once she left the forest. A third option presented itself as she studied her surroundings. The ravine deepened as it curved westward, suggesting it might lead deeper into the foothills, possibly even toward the mountains Hayes had pointed out on their journey to the cabin. If she could reach higher ground, she might be able to signal for help, or at least spot her pursuers before they saw her. Decision made, Josephine began making her way upstream, staying in the water whenever possible to minimize tracks. Her riding boots were soon sodden, and her skirts, practical as they were by Eastern standards, caught on brambles and low branches. The sun, glimpsed occasionally through the forest canopy, had passed its zenith and begun its westward descent. She had been walking for perhaps 2 hours when the ravine widened into a small, sheltered valley. Here the stream pooled into a clear pond before continuing its journey. On the far side, smoke rose from a small campfire, beside which sat a solitary figure absorbed in some task. Josephine hesitated, weighing her options. The stranger might be hostile, but might equally offer help. After a moment's deliberation, she decided to approach cautiously. If the situation seemed threatening, she could retreat to the forest before being spotted. Moving quietly along the edge of the pond, she drew close enough to make out details. The figure was a man, lean and weathered, dressed in buckskins that had seen hard use. A rifle leaned against a nearby rock within easy reach. He appeared to be cleaning a handgun, his movements precise and practiced. Just as Josephine was considering how to announce her presence without startling him, the man spoke without looking up. "You might as well come on in, ma'am. Been watching you circle that pond for 5 minutes now." Josephine froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. The stranger's awareness of her presence, despite his apparent focus on his task, was unnerving. She weighed her limited options: retreat into the forest or approach the unknown man. "Don't be alarmed," the man continued, finally looking up. His face, partially shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat, revealed keen grey eyes set in weather-worn features. A scar ran from his right temple to his jawline, white against his sun-darkened skin. Not many folks wander this far into the high country, especially not ladies in riding clothes. Josephine straightened her spine and stepped fully into the clearing. If this man meant her harm, hiding would only delay the inevitable. Better to assess the situation directly. "I didn't intend to intrude," she said with as much dignity as she could muster, conscious of her bedraggled appearance. "I'm afraid I've become somewhat lost." The man nodded, returning the now cleaned revolver to its holster with practiced ease. Most people don't get lost in these parts without good reason. His gaze was assessing but not unkind. Usually because they're running from something or someone. The accuracy of his observation startled her. 3 men were following me. They fired a shot when I tried to escape. That information brought the man to his feet in one fluid motion. Despite his lean frame, he carried himself with the contained power of a coiled spring. Describe them. Josephine complied, detailing what little she had observed of her pursuers, their appearance, weapons, the snippet of conversation she had overheard about Hargrove, and the reward. Bounty hunters, the man confirmed. Danvers brothers and probably Jim Leggett. They operate throughout the territory, not the worst of their kind, but dangerous enough when money's involved. He gestured to a fallen log near the fire. Sit, you look about done. Only then did Josephine realize how exhausted she truly was. Her legs trembled as she sank onto the offered seat. The man handed her a tin cup of coffee from the pot nestled in the coals. I'm Nathaniel Reed, he said, settling across from her. And you would be the missing Boston heiress, I'm guessing. The coffee cup nearly slipped from her fingers. How could you possibly know that? Reed's mouth quirked in what might have been the ghost of a smile. Word travels, even out here. He reached into his saddlebag and produced a folded paper that Josephine recognized as a copy of the Boston Herald. This has been circulating for a week now. $500 makes for motivated searchers. Then you know why I'm reluctant to return to town, Josephine said carefully. I know there's usually more than one side to any story, especially when money's involved. Reed studied her face. Sheriff Hayes mentioned a woman staying at his cabin, said she'd been deceived by a mail-order arrangement. Didn't mention she was a fugitive with a price on her head. I'm not a fugitive, Josephine stated firmly. I've broken no laws. William Hargrove is attempting to manipulate the situation to his advantage. The business documents he claims I improperly removed were legally transferred to me by my father before his death. Reed considered this. And you have proof of this legal transfer? Yes. The papers are secured at the cabin, he nodded, seemingly satisfied with her answer. Well, Miss Blackwell. Josephine Blackwell. Miss Blackwell, you've got a decision to make. Those men will keep looking. They know this territory better than you do. Eventually they'll find Hayes's cabin. What then? The question hung between them as Josephine considered her limited options. I could run further, perhaps catch the stage from a different settlement. And where? Back east where Hargrove has more influence? Further west where you know no one? Running only works when you've got somewhere to run to. What would you suggest, Mr. Reed? She asked, frustration edging her voice. Stand your ground. His tone was matter-of-fact. Establish yourself here, make allies, create a position that makes you more trouble than you're worth removing. The simplicity of his advice caught her off guard. Just stay. With bounty hunters. Searching for me? Wyoming territory respects grit more than pedigree, Miss Blackwell. Prove you belong here, and folks will stand with you against outsiders. Reed rose and began gathering his few belongings. First step is getting you back to Hayes' cabin before dark. Those papers you mentioned will be important if Hargrove escalates this situation. You're helping me? Josephine couldn't mask her surprise. Reed secured his bedroll behind his saddle. Let's just say I've got an interest in seeing justice done, particularly when it involves Eastern moneymen trying to extend their reach into the territories. He whistled softly, and a magnificent dun stallion emerged from the trees where it had been grazing, unseen by Josephine until now. What about my horse? She asked, remembering poor Penny, whom she'd sent galloping away as a diversion. If she's got any sense, she'll have headed back to Hayes's place. Horses usually know where the feed is stored. Reed mounted with fluid grace, then extended his hand down to her. You'll ride with me until we're clear of the valley. Less chance of leaving tracks that way." Josephine hesitated only briefly before accepting his help. Reed swung her up behind him as if she weighed nothing at all. The close contact with a stranger was scandalous by Boston standards, but such concerns seemed absurdly trivial under the circumstances. Reed guided his horse with the practiced ease of a man who had spent his life in the saddle. They followed the stream for a time before cutting away onto a rocky trail that wouldn't hold tracks. As they rode, he pointed out landmarks and explained the territory's features with the detailed knowledge of a skilled tracker. "You're familiar with this area," Josephine observed, trying to memorize the route should she need to navigate it again. "I've spent time in these hills. Good place to observe without being observed." Something in his tone prompted her next question. "Are you hunting someone, Mr. Reed?" He was silent for so long that she thought he wouldn't answer. Finally, he said, "The Blackwell gang. I've been tracking them since they hit the Hollister place." "You're the special Marshal Sheriff Hayes mentioned." Josephine realized aloud. Reed nodded. "Federal appointment. Been after Isaiah Blackwell for the better part of a year. He operates across territorial lines, which complicates things for local lawmen." "And now you're diverted from your mission to help me," Josephine said, guilt creeping into her voice. "Sometimes the best way to catch your quarry is to wait in one place until they come to you." Reed replied cryptically, "Besides, Hayes would have my hide if I left a lady to fend for herself against Danvers and his ilk." They reached a ridge overlooking the valley where Hayes's cabin stood. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the clearing. To Josephine's relief, Penny was indeed grazing peacefully near the cabin's garden patch. "Told you she'd find her way." "Home," Reed said, satisfaction evident in his voice. "Smart animal." As they descended toward the cabin, Reed suddenly reined his horse to a halt, his posture alerting Josephine to potential danger before he spoke. "Someone's been here," he said quietly. "Recently." Josephine peered over his shoulder, seeing nothing. "A miss." "How can you tell?" "Garden gates open. You strike me as the type to close things properly." Reed dismounted in one smooth motion, then helped her down. "Stay here with the horse. I'll check the cabin." Drawing his revolver, he approached the structure with a hunter's stealth, moving from cover to cover. Josephine watched anxiously as he disappeared around the back of the cabin. Minutes stretched endlessly until he re-emerged through the front door, weapon holstered. "Clear," he called. "But you've had visitors. Nothing appears to be missing, but they went through your belongings." Josephine hurried inside to find her trunk open, its contents disturbed, though not damaged. She went immediately to the loose floorboard where she had hidden her father's documents, breathing a sigh of relief when she found the oilskin packet untouched. "They didn't find what matters most," she told Reed, who stood in the doorway, watchful eyes still scanning the surrounding forest. "Good, but they'll be back." He stepped inside, closing the door behind him. "We should prepare." The next hours passed in a flurry of practical activity. Reed helped her establish basic defenses, reinforcing window shutters, creating clear sightlines around the cabin, setting up warning systems that would alert them to approaching visitors. As they worked, Josephine found herself impressed by his efficient competence and detailed knowledge of wilderness survival. "Where did you learn all this?" she asked, as they collected stones to create a defensive wall near the garden. "Army taught me the basics. Life taught me the rest." Reed stacked another rock with precision. "Spent 8 years as an Army scout. Before that, lived with the Shoshone for a time after my parents' wagon train was attacked." He glanced at her. "You learn quick, or you don't survive." The simple philosophy echoed something Hayes had said about the territory. Adaptation wasn't just beneficial, it was essential. Josephine found herself wondering what other skills she would need to acquire to truly establish herself in this demanding land. As dusk approached, Reed built a small fire in the cabin's hearth and prepared A simple meal from the provisions Hayes had stocked. The domestic scene struck Josephine as surreal, sitting at a table with this scarred, dangerous man whose quiet competence both reassured and intimidated her. "Tell me about Isaiah Blackwell," she said as they ate. "Is there any actual relation to my family?" Reed shook his head. "Not likely. He adopted the name years ago, supposedly after killing a man named Blackwell and taking his identity. Used to ride with Quantrill's raiders during the war, developed a taste for violence and never lost it." His expression darkened. "He's killed at least 30 men that I know of, women too, children. And yet he roams free," Josephine said softly. "Justice moves differently out here. No formal courts in much of the territory. No prisons to speak of. Law is often whatever the strongest man says it is." Reed's gray eyes met hers. "That's changing, slowly. Men like Hayes help. But it's still wild country. Is that why you became a marshal? To bring order?" His laugh held no humor. "I became a marshal because I'm good at tracking and better at killing when necessary. The government found that useful." He set down his fork. "But yes, there's satisfaction in knowing some men won't hurt others anymore because of what I've done." After the meal, Reed insisted on taking the first watch while Josephine rested. "Dawn comes early," he said, "and we've work to do tomorrow." Despite her exhaustion, sleep proved elusive. The day's events kept replaying in her mind. The bounty hunter's pursuit, her desperate flight through the forest, the unexpected alliance with this enigmatic lawman. So much had changed in the brief time since she'd left Boston. The proper young lady who had boarded the train east seemed like a stranger now. Morning arrived with a spectacular sunrise that painted the distant mountains in shades of gold and rose. Josephine found Reed already awake, watching the forest edge with the patient focus of a predator. "No sign of visitors in the night," he reported, "but they'll keep searching. We need to strengthen your position." "How do you propose we do that?" Josephine asked, putting coffee on to boil. 3 steps. Reed held up fingers as he enumerated. "First, secure legal recognition of your business ownership. That means filing proper papers with the Territorial Court in Cheyenne. Second, establish yourself as a contributing member of the community. Makes people invested in your welfare. Third, create physical security that makes coming after you too costly for bounty hunters to attempt." The systematic approach appealed to Josephine's practical nature. "The first requires travel to Cheyenne. The second means I need employment or a business in Whispering Pines. The third—" She gestured around the cabin. "We've already begun." Reed nodded approvingly. Quick mind, useful out here. He accepted the coffee she offered. "Hayes mentioned you have publishing experience. Territory's newspapers are always struggling. Might be a place to start." "The Territorial Gazette," Josephine mused. Mary Wilson suggested her husband might need help with the business aspects. "Ben Wilson's a good man, fair-minded, respected in the community." Reed sipped his coffee thoughtfully. "Could do worse for an ally." Their planning was interrupted by the distant sound of hoofbeats approaching. Reed was on his feet instantly, positioning himself by the window with a clear view of the trail. "Hayes," he announced with evident relief. "Alone." The sheriff appeared. Moments later, riding hard. His expression was grim as he dismounted in front of the cabin. "Trouble," he said without preamble as he entered. "Danvers brothers are in town, asking questions about a Boston woman." His eyes widened slightly at the sight of Reed. "Marshal, didn't expect to find you here." "Crossed paths with Miss Blackwell yesterday. She was being pursued by bounty hunters." Reed's tone was neutral, but Josephine detected an undercurrent of tension between the two men. Hayes turned to Josephine. "You're all right, thanks to Marshal Reed," she confirmed, "though they searched the cabin while I was gone." Hayes frowned. "Bold move, entering an officer's residence without permission." $500 makes men bold, Reed observed. Or foolish. They've gone further than that, Hayes said grimly. They've convinced Judge Patterson to issue a detention order. Claims you're wanted for theft in Massachusetts. That's absurd, Josephine protested. I have the legal transfer documents right here. She retrieved the oilskin packet from its hiding place. Hayes examined the papers carefully. These looked legitimate, but Patterson's already signed the order. He's not one to admit a mistake easily. Patterson's in Preston's pocket, Reed said. Always has been. If Preston stands to gain from this Hargrove fellow finding Miss Blackwell, the judge will do what he's told. Preston? Josephine asked. Who's that? Elias Preston. Owns the bank. In Whispering Pines. Has interests in most businesses worth having. Hayes's expression was troubled. Not a man to cross lightly. Why would a local banker care about my situation? Josephine asked. Reed and Hayes exchanged glances. Connections, Reed said finally. Eastern money men stick together. Your Hargrove probably offered Preston a piece of whatever he stands to gain by controlling your father's business. The revelation that her personal drama had attracted the attention of powerful local interests was disturbing. What had begun as one man's attempt to control her inheritance had expanded into something more complex and dangerous. What options do I have? She asked, looking between the two men. Limited, Hayes admitted. With a detention order, I'm officially required to bring you in. Patterson's likely to rule in Preston's favor, regardless of your documentation. Unless we change the equation, Reed interjected. Give Patterson and Preston reason to reconsider. How? Josephine demanded. By making you more valuable to the community than to Preston. Reed's eyes held a calculating gleam. Territory needs businesses, development progress, things that bring tax revenue and stability. Understanding dawned on Hayes's face. The Hollister property. It's still unclaimed. Land Office hasn't processed the paperwork since the raid. Precisely, Reed nodded. Miss Blackwell could file a homestead claim. As a woman, she's eligible under the Homestead Act. With improvements, she'd have full ownership in 5 years. But the buildings were destroyed, Josephine protested. I don't have the resources to rebuild an entire ranch. Don't need to rebuild. All of it initially, Reed countered. Just enough to satisfy the improvement requirements. The land itself is the real value. Water rights, timber, grazing. Hayes was nodding slowly. It might work. Property owner with development plans carries weight, even with Patterson, especially if there's potential tax revenue involved. I know nothing about ranching, Josephine pointed out. You know business, Reed replied. Rest can be learned, or partnered for. Hayes studied her thoughtfully. You came west expecting to marry a rancher. Different circumstances, but the same basic premise. Could you adapt to that life if it meant securing your independence? The question gave Josephine pause. She had indeed traveled west with the expectation of becoming a rancher's wife, helping to build something lasting in this new territory. The deception that brought her here didn't change that fundamental willingness to embrace a new life. Yes, she said finally. If it means establishing myself free from Hargrove's influence, I could learn what's necessary. It won't be easy, Hayes warned. Rebuilding after the raid, potential hostility from Preston, the ongoing threat from the Blackwell gang. Few. Worthwhile things are easy, Sheriff, Josephine replied, with more confidence than she felt. My father used to say, difficulty is simply the admission price for accomplishment. A rare smile transformed Reed's scarred features. Your father sounds like a man who would have done well in Wyoming territory, Miss Blackwell. The three spent the remainder of the morning formulating plans. Hayes would return to town and gather information about Preston's involvement and the Danvers brothers' movements. Reed would escort Josephine to the land office in Laramie, where she could file her homestead claim away from Patterson's immediate influence. Once the claim was registered, they would assess the Hollister property and determine what improvements could be made quickly to strengthen her position. "What about Isaiah Blackwell?" Josephine asked, as Reed prepared to depart temporarily to retrieve supplies they would need for the journey. "Aren't you supposed to be hunting him?" "Sometimes the most effective hunt involves creating circumstances where your prey comes to you," Reed replied cryptically. "Isaiah has patterns. He returns to places he's hit before, checking for recovery. Valuable targets he might have missed. You're using me as bait," Josephine realized, both alarmed and oddly impressed by the strategy. "Not intentionally," Reed clarified. "But your presence at the Hollister place would be noted. Word travels. Isaiah might become curious about the woman rebuilding after his destruction." "And you'd be waiting," Hayes concluded, his tone suggesting he wasn't entirely comfortable with the approach. "Within appropriate distance," Reed agreed. Miss Blackwell's safety would remain the priority. As the men finalized arrangements outside, Josephine took stock of her situation. In just days, she had gone from mail-order bride to potential homesteader, from victim of deception to active participant in a federal marshal strategy to capture a notorious outlaw. The proper Boston lady she had once been would have been scandalized by such developments, but that woman seemed increasingly distant, a portrait in fading sepia rather than living color. Here, in this rugged territory with its harsh beauty and demanding nature, she was becoming someone new, someone stronger, more capable, more willing to shape her own destiny, regardless of convention or expectation. When Reed returned several hours later with supplies, Josephine was ready. She had packed only what was essential, leaving behind the trappings of her Boston life in favor of practical necessities for frontier survival. "Last chance to reconsider," Hayes said as he prepared to depart for town. "Once you file that homestead claim, you're committed to this territory. To this life." Josephine met his gaze steadily. "I was committed the moment I stepped off that stagecoach, Sheriff. The only difference now is that I'm choosing my path rather than following one laid out by deception." As Hayes rode away, Reed finished securing their provisions to his packhorse. "We'll leave at first light," he said. 2 days' ride to Laramie if the weather holds." "And after that?" Josephine asked. "After I've filed the claim?" Reed's gray eyes held hers for a long moment. "After that, Miss Blackwell, we build something from the ashes, something strong enough to withstand whatever storms come next." The simple declaration carried weight beyond its words. They would be creating not just physical structures, but a foundation for a new life, one that neither of them could have anticipated when their paths crossed beside that hidden pond. As the sun began its descent behind the distant mountains, Josephine found herself looking westward with anticipation rather than fear. The journey ahead would be difficult, perhaps dangerous, but for the first time since her father's death, she felt truly alive, fully engaged in charting her own course through uncharted territory. Whatever came next, she would face it on her own terms. The journey to Laramie took longer than the 2 days Reed had estimated. Spring storms rolled through the foothills, forcing them to seek shelter in an abandoned trapper's cabin during the worst downpours. The close quarters might have been uncomfortable under different circumstances, but Reed maintained a respectful distance and professional demeanor that put Josephine at ease, despite the impropriety of their situation by Eastern standards. During the enforced delays, Reed revealed more of his background in response to Josephine's careful questions. He had come west as a child with his family, part of a wagon train seeking new opportunities after the financial panic of '57. Shoshone raiders had attacked their party near South Pass, killing most of the adults, including Reed's parents. Rather than killing the 8-year-old boy, an elder warrior had claimed him, bringing him into the tribe where he lived for nearly 7 years before circumstances returned him to white society. That experience gave you an advantage as an army. "A scout," Josephine observed as they huddled near the cabin's small fire, rain drumming steadily on the roof. Reed nodded. "Army valued what I knew, tracking languages, thinking like the people they were fighting." A shadow crossed his features. "Didn't always sit right, using those skills against the very people who'd taught me to survive. Is that why you became a marshal instead?" His gaze met hers across the flames. "Tracking outlaws lets me sleep at night. They've chosen their path, knowing the consequences." By the time they reached Laramie, Josephine had gained new appreciation for the vastness of the territory and the isolation of settlements scattered across its expanse. The town itself was considerably larger than Whispering Pines, boasting a proper main street lined with businesses, a courthouse, and even a small theater advertising traveling performances. "We'll go to the land office first," Reed instructed as they rode down the muddy main street. "Then secure rooms at the hotel. Best to complete our business quickly before word of your presence spreads." The Territorial Land Office occupied a solid brick building near the courthouse. Inside, clerks moved between tall shelves of leather-bound records and document cases. Reed approached an older man whose spectacles and ink-stained fingers marked him as someone who had spent decades processing the paperwork that transformed wilderness into deeded property. "Martin," Reed greeted him. "Been a while." The clerk looked up, recognition brightening his weathered features. "Nathaniel Reed. Last time you darkened my door was the Wilson claim dispute." His curious gaze shifted to Josephine. "This doesn't look like official Marshal business. Private matter. Miss Josephine Blackwell wishes to file a homestead claim on the former Hollister property in Albany County." Martin's bushy eyebrows rose. "Hollister Place, after what happened there. Brave woman." He rifled through a drawer and extracted a map, spreading it across the counter. "Properties still listed as unclaimed. Original deed holder deceased without heirs of record. Miss Blackwell qualifies under the Homestead Act," Reed continued. "She intends to develop the property for mixed agricultural and commercial use." The clerk studied Josephine with new interest. "Ambitious undertaking for a lady alone." "I'm not without resources or determination, Mr. Martin," Josephine replied, meeting his gaze steadily. "And I understand the territory benefits from development of abandoned properties." "Indeed it does." Martin nodded appreciatively. "Taxes, commerce, stability, all in short supply out here." He pulled several forms from a shelf behind him. "You'll need to complete these: claim registration, declaration of intent, proof of eligibility." For the next hour, Josephine carefully filled out the required documents, while Martin explained the homestead requirements: residence on the property, specific improvements within set timeframes, and the 5-year residency requirement before receiving final deed. "You understand that under the Act, you must actually live on the property," Martin emphasized. "Can't just hire others to make improvements while you stay in town." "I understand completely," Josephine assured him. "I intend to rebuild the main house as my residence immediately." When the final form was signed and notarized, Martin applied the territorial seal and handed Josephine her copy of the claim. "Congratulations, Miss Blackwell. You're now the provisional owner of 160 acres of Wyoming territory, pending completion of homestead requirements." The official acknowledgement of her claim brought unexpected emotion. In Boston, women of her class rarely owned property in their own names. Here, with a few signatures, she had gained legal right to a significant piece of land that represented not just physical space, but the foundation for her independent future. "Now comes the hard part," Reed commented as they left the land office. "Turning that paper into something substantial enough to ward off challenges." "From Preston and Hargrove, you mean?" Josephine said, among others. Reed's expression was grim. Word of a woman claiming the Hollister property will travel fast. Various interests will take notice. They secured rooms at the Laramie Hotel, a modest but clean establishment catering primarily to businessmen and travelers passing through on the way further west. After a proper meal, the first Josephine had enjoyed in days, Reed suggested they visit the local mercantile to secure supplies for rebuilding efforts. "Prices are better here than in Whispering Pines," he explained, "and we can arrange delivery without Preston knowing what we're planning until the wagons arrive." The mercantile owner, a shrewd businessman named Howard Jenkins, listened with interest as Reed outlined what they would need. His eyebrows rose at the scope of the order. "Rebuilding the entire Hollister place?" he asked, calculating figures on a notepad. "That's a substantial investment, Marshal." "Just the essential structures initially," Reed clarified. "Main house, barn, basic outbuildings." Jenkins glanced at Josephine. "And the lady is the property owner," she stated firmly. "Josephine Blackwell. I filed a homestead claim on the land." Understanding dawned in the merchant's eyes. "Ah, staking your claim before others can move in. Smart. Territory needs more forward-thinking landowners." He tapped his pencil against the notepad. "I can have the first wagons ready in 3 days. Will require 50% payment in advance, given the distance and circumstances." "Circumstances?" Josephine inquired. Jenkins hesitated, glancing at Reed. "Hollister Place has a certain reputation now. Some teamsters might be reluctant to deliver there without additional compensation." "Because of the raid," Reed supplied. "Exactly. Isaiah Blackwell isn't known for appreciating people rebuilding what he's destroyed." Jenkins lowered his voice. "Word is he leaves messages for those who try." The implied threat hung in the air. Josephine considered the merchant's words carefully. "Mr. Jenkins, I understand your concern. I'll pay the advance plus 20% additional for the driver's trouble." Jenkins nodded, impressed by her directness. "That should solve any reluctance. I'll arrange for the first wagons to depart Wednesday morning." When they had concluded their business and returned to the hotel, Reed regarded Josephine with newfound respect. "You handled that well, acknowledged the risk without being intimidated by it. Growing up in my father's publishing business taught me that negotiations work best when all parties acknowledge the actual circumstances, not just the polite fiction surrounding them," she replied. "And I refuse to be intimidated by Isaiah, Blackwell, or anyone else. I've come too far to retreat now." Reed's expression softened slightly. "Your father raised a remarkable daughter, Miss Blackwell." The unexpected compliment warmed her more than it should have. Josephine had grown accustomed to Reed's stoic demeanor and sparse speech. This glimpse of something more personal behind his professional facade intrigued her. He believed women should be educated to think, not merely to ornament a parlor, she said softly. A progressive view that wasn't always appreciated in Boston society. Wyoming territory might surprise you then. Women have more rights here than in many eastern states. Some even vote in local elections. This revelation startled Josephine. "Truly? Women voting?" Reed nodded. "Territory needs everyone's contribution to survive." Hard to justify denying half the population a voice in how things are governed when they're working alongside men to build communities. The conversation was interrupted by a knock at Josephine's door. A hotel clerk handed her a telegram that had just arrived. "It's from Sheriff Hayes," she said, scanning the brief message. "He says Preston has learned of my departure. The Danvers brothers left town, suddenly heading west." She looked up at Reed. "He thinks they're coming here." Reed's expression hardened. "We'll leave first light tomorrow. Different route back. Avoid the main trails." He moved toward the door. "Lock this behind me. Don't open for anyone but me or the clerk you just met." Alone in her room, Josephine paced restlessly. The reality of her situation pressed in from all sides, pursuit from multiple directions, a dangerous commitment to rebuild in territory still threatened by raiders, and her increasing reliance on a man she barely knew, yet found herself trusting. Implicitly, sleep came fitfully that night, her dreams filled with burning buildings and faceless pursuers. She woke before dawn, dressing quickly in the practical riding clothes Reed had helped her purchase in Laramie. The dress and accessories she had brought from Boston remained in her trunk, relics of a life that seemed increasingly distant and foreign. Reed was waiting in the hotel's small dining room, alert despite the early hour. They broke their fast in companionable silence, then settled their bill and retrieved their horses from the livery stable. "We'll follow the river north, then cut east through Fisher's Pass," Reed explained as they rode out of town in the grey, pre-dawn light. "Adds a day to the journey, but keeps us off the main trails where Danvers might look for us." The route took them through stunning landscapes of rocky canyons and high meadows, bursting with wildflowers. Under different circumstances, Josephine might have reveled in the raw beauty surrounding them. Instead, she found herself constantly scanning the horizon, alert for signs of pursuit. By midday, they had reached a high plateau overlooking the winding river below. Reed reined his horse to a halt, studying the trail behind them with a practiced eye. "Riders," he said finally. "5, maybe 6, following our path." "The Danvers brothers?" Josephine asked, fear knotting in her stomach. "Possibly. Or regular travelers." Reed's hand rested casually near his holstered revolver. "We'll know soon enough. There's an abandoned mining camp 2 miles ahead, defensible position if needed." They pushed on at a faster pace, the horses responding to their riders' tension. The mining camp materialized as they rounded a bend, collection of weathered wooden structures nestled against a cliff face. Signs of hasty abandonment were everywhere, from tools left to rust beside collapsed sluice boxes to personal belongings still visible through broken windows. "Silver played out 10 years ago," Reed explained as they dismounted. "Camp emptied overnight. Good place to determine if those riders are just passing through or hunting us specifically." He led the horses into a tumble-down stable, then guided Josephine to a cabin with sightlines down the trail they had traveled. Inside, he moved with practiced efficiency, clearing debris from the windows and positioning her where she would be concealed but able to see approaching riders. "If it comes to trouble, stay inside," he instructed, checking his weapons. "I've survived worse odds." The quiet confidence in his voice should have been reassuring. Instead, it underscored the danger of their situation. Josephine found herself studying Reed's profile as he watched the trail, noting the tension in his jaw and the stillness that seemed to envelop him when focused, the stillness of a predator waiting for prey. "Why are you really helping me?" she asked suddenly. The question had lingered in her mind since their first encounter. Reed didn't shift his gaze from the trail. "Told you, interest in seeing justice done." "There's more to it than that," Josephine pressed. "This goes beyond professional duty or common courtesy." For a long moment she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, without looking at her, he said, "My sister, Elizabeth. She was taken east after the raid that killed our parents. Adopted by a banker in Philadelphia. I found her 10 years later." His voice hardened. She'd been married off to one of his business associates, man 3 times her age, who treated her like property. Understanding dawned. "You see something of her in mine." Reed nodded once, a barely perceptible movement. "She didn't have choices. Didn't have anyone to stand with her against men who saw her as something to be controlled." His gaze finally met hers. "Everyone deserves the chance to determine their own path, Miss Blackwell, especially those who've had that right denied them." The personal revelation created a new dimension to Josephine's understanding of the Marshal. His commitment to helping her wasn't just professional, it was deeply personal, rooted in his inability to help someone he had cared about. Before she could respond, Reed's attention snapped back to the trail. "They've stopped, examining our tracks at the cutoff." His voice was a controlled whisper. "Not casual travelers." Josephine peered through the grimy window. In the distance, she could make out mounted figures conferring where the trail branched. After a brief discussion, they continued toward the mining camp. 6 men, Reed confirmed. Danvers brothers in the lead. They must have picked up additional men in Laramie. "Can we outrun them?" Josephine asked, calculating their options. Reed shook his head. "Not with our horses needing rest. Better to face them here on ground I can control." He checked his revolver one final time. "Stay inside, no matter what you hear." With that, he slipped out the door, moving silently between the abandoned structures, until he disappeared from view. Josephine gripped the shotgun he had insisted she carry, her heart pounding as the riders approached the camp's perimeter. The Danvers brothers were easily identifiable at the front, matching beards and broad-brimmed hats, rifles resting casually across their saddles. Behind them rode 4 men Josephine didn't recognize, their expressions suggesting they were hired guns rather than lawmen. "Spread out," the elder Danvers instructed. "They're here somewhere. $500 if we take the woman alive. Marshal's not our concern unless he interferes." The casual discussion of her capture sent a chill through Josephine. These men viewed her not as a person, but as merchandise to be delivered for payment. The dehumanizing perspective strengthened her resolve to resist. The riders separated, moving methodically through the abandoned camp. Minutes stretched endlessly as Josephine waited, every sense heightened by fear and determination. A sudden shout indicated one of the men had discovered their horses in the stable. "Over here!" he called. "They can't be far!" What happened next unfolded with shocking speed. Reed materialized from behind a collapsed ore cart, his revolver already drawn. "Federal Marshal," he announced, voice carrying across the clearing. "You men are interfering with official business. Lay down your weapons." The younger Danvers spun toward Reed's voice, raising his rifle. Reed's shot dropped him before he could fire, the precision of the Marshal's aim evident as Danvers clutched his shoulder and fell from his horse, weapon clattering to the ground. Chaos erupted. The remaining 5 men scattered for cover. Bullets splintering wood around Reed's position. He moved like water, flowing from one position of concealment to another, his return fire measured and deliberate. From her vantage point, Josephine could see what the attackers couldn't. Reed was maneuvering them into crossfire positions where they endangered each other as much as him. One of the hired guns fell, caught by his companion's wild shot. Another cried out as Reed's bullet found his leg. The elder Danvers, more cautious than his brother, had taken position behind the stable. "Give up the woman, Marshal!" he shouted. "This doesn't concern the federal government. Miss Blackwell is under my protection," Reed called back. "That makes her my concern. Throw down your weapons and you can ride out of here." A bullet splintered the window frame beside Josephine, showering her with debris. One of the hired guns had worked his way around to the cabin and spotted movement at the window. She ducked as a second shot punched through the glass. Training. The shotgun on the door. Josephine waited, heart hammering against her ribs. If the man entered, she would have one chance to defend herself. Outside, the gunfire had intensified, Reed exchanging shots with the remaining attackers. The door burst open. Josephine fired without hesitation, the shotgun's roar deafening in the confined space. The hired gun staggered backward, wounded but not killed by the buckshot. As he raised his pistol, a second shot rang out, Reed's, and the man collapsed. Suddenly, silence fell over the mining camp. Josephine remained frozen, shotgun still trained on the doorway, ears ringing from the thunderous report of her weapon. "Josephine?" Reed's voice came from just outside. "Are you hit?" "No," she managed. "I'm unharmed." He appeared in the doorway, a bleeding gash across his forehead, but otherwise intact. "They're retreating. 3 wounded, including both Danvers. The rest decided. $500 wasn't worth dying for." Relief flooded through her, followed immediately by concern as she noticed blood seeping through his shirt sleeve. "You're wounded." Reed glanced at his arm, as if noticing the injury for the first time. "Bullet grazed me. Nothing serious." "Let me tend it," Josephine insisted, setting aside the shotgun. "It's the least I can do after you risked your life for me." He submitted to her ministrations with reluctance, sitting stiffly as she cleaned and bandaged the wound using supplies from his saddlebags. The closeness required for the task brought a new awareness of him as a man rather than just a protector. The lean strength of his frame, the faint scent of leather and gunpowder that clung to him, the controlled rhythm of his breathing. "You should not have had to fire that shotgun," he said finally, breaking the silence between them. "I miscalculated their movements." "I made my choice to defend myself," Josephine replied, securing the bandage. "Just as you've been teaching me to do since we met." Their eyes met, something unspoken passing between them. For a breathless moment, the air seemed charged with possibility. Then Reed stood abruptly, moving to check the perimeter. "We should move on," he said, his tone once again professional. They might return with reinforcements. As they prepared to depart, Josephine found herself replaying that moment of connection, trying to understand what had passed between them. Reed had revealed more of himself today than in all their previous interactions combined, both in words and actions. The knowledge that he saw in her situation echoes his sister's plight and explained much about his commitment to helping her. But there had been something else in his eyes during that brief moment, something personal rather than protective, something that suggested his interest in her welfare might extend beyond the parallels to his sister's story. The realization both thrilled and unsettled her. In Boston, relationships followed predictable patterns, governed by social conventions and expectations. Here in the Territory, those familiar guidelines didn't apply. She was navigating uncharted waters, drawn to a man unlike any she had known before, a scarred, dangerous protector whose quiet strength and hidden depths fascinated her even as they warned her to maintain distance. As they rode away from the mining camp, Josephine found herself watching Reed's straight-backed figure ahead of her on the trail, wondering what other secrets lay behind his composed exterior, and how many more layers she would discover before their paths inevitably diverged. They reached the Hollister property 3 days later, having taken a circuitous route to avoid further encounters with the Danvers brothers or their hired guns. The sight that greeted Josephine as they crested the final ridge was sobering. Blackened timber where the main house had stood, partially collapsed outbuildings, and the skeletal remains of the barn against the backdrop of otherwise stunning natural beauty. "Worse than I expected," she admitted as they rode down into the valley. The contrast between the destruction wrought by human violence and the vibrant spring landscape surrounding it struck her as particularly jarring. Reed surveyed the property with a tracker's eye. "Hollister built good structures. Foundations are likely intact. Stone fireplace is still standing. We can rebuild on what remains." His use of "we" wasn't lost on Josephine. Whatever had passed between them at the mining camp remained unspoken, but Reed's commitment to helping her establish her claim had deepened. He was no longer simply escorting her for protection. He had become invested in the success of her venture. They dismounted near what had been the main house. Up close, the destruction was even more evident. Charred beams, melted glass, the smell of ashes still lingering months after the fire. Yet amidst the ruin, Josephine could see the potential that had drawn James Hollister to this location. A clear creek ran along the eastern boundary, providing abundant water. Rolling meadows stretched to the north, perfect for grazing cattle. Pine forests on the western ridge offered timber and shelter from winter winds. "It's beautiful land," she said softly. "Despite everything," Reed nodded. "Hollister chose well. Good water, natural boundaries, defensible position." He pointed to the ridgeline above them. "From there you can see anyone approaching for miles." They spent the remainder of the day exploring the property, Reed pointing out features that weren't immediately apparent to Josephine's inexperienced eye. The natural spring behind what had been the barn, soil particularly suited for gardening near the creek, a stand of fruit trees that had somehow survived both neglect and raiders. The only structure left relatively intact was a small bunkhouse about 100 yards from the main house site. Its wooden walls were scorched on the exterior, but the interior remained habitable, if barely. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, while simple bunks lined the others. A rough table and chairs stood in the center, covered with dust, but otherwise serviceable. "This could be your temporary quarters while we rebuild," Reed suggested, examining the roof for leaks. "Needs some repair, but it's solid." "We should clean it thoroughly first," Josephine said, already planning the work needed to make the space livable. Her mind was shifting to practical matters, how to establish a functioning homestead from these ruins, how to meet the improvement requirements of her claim, how to create security in this isolated location. As twilight approached, they made camp near the bunkhouse, neither willing to sleep inside until they had thoroughly inspected it for unwelcome wildlife and potential hazards. Reed built a small fire while Josephine prepared a simple meal from their supplies. The domestic scene might have seemed incongruous given their circumstances, but Josephine found unexpected comfort in the routine tasks. "First supply wagon should arrive within 2 days," Reed said as they ate. "We'll need to clear the old house site before rebuilding can begin." "I've been thinking about that," Josephine replied. "Rather than trying to reconstruct exactly what was here before, perhaps a smaller, more defensible structure would be wiser initially, something I can maintain and protect more easily until the situation with Isaiah Blackwell is resolved." Reed's eyebrows rose slightly. Practical thinking. Most people tried to replace what was lost rather than adapting to new circumstances. "My father always said, adversity reveals what's truly essential," Josephine said. "This situation certainly qualifies as adversity." A ghost of a smile touched Reed's features. "Your father sounds like someone I would have respected." "I think he would have said the same about you," Josephine replied, surprised by how much the thought mattered to her. They fell silent, watching the fire cast dancing shadows across the ruined homestead. Despite the destruction surrounding them, Josephine felt a curious sense of possibility taking root. This land was hers now, her responsibility, her opportunity, her future. Whatever came next would be of her own making, not dictated by William. Hargrove or Boston society's expectations. Morning brought renewed purpose. They began by thoroughly cleaning the bunkhouse, removing years of dust and debris. Josephine discovered linens in a trunk that, while musty, could be washed and reused. Reed repaired broken window frames and secured the door with a new lock he had purchased in Laramie. By midday, the small structure had been transformed from abandoned ruin to rudimentary shelter. It wasn't elegant or comfortable by Eastern standards, but it was clean, weatherproof and defensible, a starting point from which to rebuild. "I've been thinking about our next steps," Josephine said, as they paused for a meal in the shade of a towering cottonwood. "We need lumber for construction, furnishings for basic comfort, and eventually livestock, if this is to become a ranch." Reed nodded approval at her systematic approach. "Jenkins's wagons will deliver the first supplies. For livestock, there's a horse trader named Franklin who runs stock between Laramie and Cheyenne. Honest man, fair prices, he could help you build a small herd. And workers," Josephine asked. "I can't possibly manage all the necessary construction alone, even with your help." "There are men in Whispering Pines looking for honest work," Reed replied. "Once word spreads that you're rebuilding, some will come. Hayes can vouch for those who are trustworthy." Their planning was interrupted by the distant sound of approaching riders. Reed was on his feet instantly, hand moving to his revolver as he scanned the ridge where the main trail descended into the valley. "Two riders," he said, tension evident in his stance. "Coming fast." Josephine's heart raced as she remembered their last encounter with unexpected visitors. Danvers again? "Can't tell yet." Into the bunkhouse, rifles by the door. She complied without argument, retrieving the Winchester he had positioned there earlier. Through the window she watched Reed take up position behind the stone remains of the main house. Fireplace, a natural defensive point with clear sightlines to the approaching riders. As the visitors drew closer, Josephine recognized the broad-shouldered figure of Sheriff Hayes. Beside him rode a woman Josephine didn't recognize, her posture suggesting comfort in the saddle despite her proper riding habit. Reed emerged from cover, holstering his weapon as he recognized the visitors. "Hayes," he called, "didn't expect you so soon." The sheriff dismounted with an urgency that sent a flutter of alarm through Josephine. "Trouble's brewing, Reed. Thought you should know immediately." His gaze shifted to Josephine as she emerged from the bunkhouse. "Miss Blackwell, glad to see you're safe." "What kind of trouble?" Reed asked, his voice tight. "Preston's made his move," Hayes replied grimly. "Convinced Judge Patterson to issue an injunction against your homestead claim. Miss Blackwell claims the land was promised to the bank as collateral for loans Hollister took before his death." Josephine's stomach clenched. "That's impossible. The land office had no record of any such arrangement. Territory records and county records don't always align," Hayes explained. "Preston's produced documents showing Hollister signed over rights as collateral 3 months before the raid. Patterson accepted them as valid." Reed's expression hardened. "Convenient timing. These documents suddenly appear after Miss Blackwell files her claim." "Too convenient," Hayes agreed, but Patterson ruled. "Injunction formally blocks any improvements to the property until ownership is determined at trial." "When will that be?" Josephine asked, struggling to keep her voice steady. 3 weeks from now. Patterson's court only sits monthly in Whispering Pines." Hayes removed his hat, running a hand through his hair in frustration. "There's more. Hargrove arrived yesterday. He's staying at Miranda Reynolds' boarding house." The news hit Josephine like a physical blow. William Hargrove, here in Wyoming Territory, less than 15 miles away. The man she had fled across the continent had followed, determined to claim what he believed was rightfully his. "Has he filed any legal actions?" Reed asked, his gaze flicking to Josephine with concern. "Not yet, but he's been closeted with Preston for hours. They're planning something beyond just challenging the homestead claim." Hayes gestured to the woman who had accompanied him. "That's why I brought Charlotte." The woman dismounted gracefully, approaching with confident strides. About 40, with streaks of silver in her dark hair and intelligent eyes that missed nothing, she carried herself with the assurance of someone accustomed to being heard. "Charlotte Wilson," she introduced herself. "Ben's sister. I practice law. In Cheyenne. A female lawyer?" Josephine couldn't mask her surprise. Charlotte smiled, the expression warming her otherwise serious features. "Wyoming Territory is more progressive than most places, Miss Blackwell. I've been admitted to the Territorial bar for 6 years now." "Charlotte specializes in property disputes and women's legal rights," Hayes explained. "I telegraphed her after learning about Patterson's injunction. The sheriff believes your situation requires specialized knowledge," Charlotte added, "particularly given the apparent coordination between Mr. Preston and your former acquaintance from Boston." Reed had been listening intently, his expression growing more troubled with each revelation. They're moving faster than expected, coordinating efforts against Miss Blackwell on multiple fronts. But why? Josephine asked, bewildered by the intensity of the opposition marshalling against her. This is just one property. Why would Preston go to such lengths to block my claim? Charlotte and Hayes exchanged glances. It's not just about this property, Charlotte said carefully. According to my sources, Preston has been quietly acquiring water rights throughout the county. The creek that runs through your land feeds the watershed for much of the Eastern Valley. Without control of this water source, his other acquisitions lose significant value. And Hargrove, Josephine pressed, what does he gain by allying with Preston? Access to your father's business, Reed said, understanding dawning. If Hargrove can establish legal control over you or your assets here, he could potentially extend that control to your Eastern holdings. The calculated nature of the threat stunned Josephine. This wasn't simply about a homestead claim or even her inheritance. It was about power. Control over both the territory's natural resources and her personal freedom. What options do I have? She asked, looking between Hayes, Reed, and Charlotte. The female lawyer considered carefully. Several, though none without risk. First, we challenge the injunction directly, questioning the authenticity of Preston's documents. Second, we continue improvements despite the injunction, establishing de facto possession. Third, we shift strategy entirely. Incorporate a business entity to hold the property rather than relying on the homestead claim. Each approach has consequences, Hayes warned. Challenging the documents means surviving Patterson's court, where Preston holds sway. Ignoring the injunction could result in arrest, and incorporation requires capital and business partners. There's a fourth option, Reed said, quietly, one that would resolve both the homestead challenge and Hargrove's designs. His grey eyes met Josephine's steadily. Marriage. The word hung in the air between them. Josephine's breath caught as she realized the implications. Under territorial law, a married woman's property would be legally protected from claims against her as an individual. Moreover, her husband would have clear legal standing to defend those interests against both Preston and Hargrove. Are you proposing, Marshal Reed? Charlotte asked, a hint of amusement in her voice despite the serious circumstances. Presenting an option, Reed replied evenly, though Josephine didn't miss the slight color that rose in his weathered cheeks. One with legal advantages in the current situation. Hayes cleared his throat awkwardly. It would certainly complicate matters for Preston and Hargrove. Married women have specific protections under territorial statutes that Charlotte helped draft. Josephine found herself unable to formulate a response. The suggestion of marriage, even as a legal strategy, had caught her completely off guard. She had come west expecting to marry a stranger named Daniel Morgan, only to discover she had been deceived. Now another unexpected proposal had emerged, this time from a man she had come to respect and, if she were honest with herself, care for more deeply than she had anticipated. I need time to consider all options, she finally managed, avoiding Reed's gaze. This isn't a decision to make hastily. Charlotte nodded approvingly. Wise approach. Meanwhile, I'll prepare legal challenges to both the injunction and any claims Hargrove might file. Best to be ready on all fronts. As Hayes and Charlotte prepared to depart, the sheriff needed to return to town before his absence was noted, and Charlotte wished to examine the land office records before the hearing. Reed pulled Hayes aside for a private conversation. Josephine found herself grateful for Charlotte's company as the men conferred. Sheriff Hayes speaks highly of you, the female lawyer commented. Says you've shown remarkable adaptability for an Eastern woman. Necessity more than virtue, Josephine admitted. When one's plans collapse entirely, adaptation is the only path forward, Charlotte smiled. That's precisely the attitude that built this territory. Men get the credit in history books, but it's women like you who established homes, businesses, and communities, while the men were busy shooting at each other and claiming land. The observation brought a small smile to Josephine's lips. "I hadn't thought of it that way." "You should," Charlotte said firmly. "What you're attempting here, rebuilding, from destruction, claiming your independence, it matters beyond just your personal circumstances. Every woman who establishes herself as a property owner, business operator, or professional in this territory makes it easier for those who follow." The perspective shifted something in Josephine's thinking. She had been so focused on her immediate challenges, escaping Hargrove, securing her inheritance, establishing her claim, that she hadn't considered the broader implications of her actions. If she succeeded, she would indeed be creating a precedent that other women might follow. When Hayes and Charlotte departed, promising to return with legal documents and further information about Preston and Hargrove's activities, an awkward silence fell between Josephine and Reed. The Marshal busied himself checking the perimeter of the property, while Josephine returned to organizing the bunkhouse. Neither mentioned his suggestion of marriage, though it hung unspoken between them. Evening brought a spectacular sunset that painted the western sky in shades of crimson and gold. Josephine sat on a rough-hewn bench outside the bunkhouse, watching the display with quiet appreciation. Despite the day's troubling news, the beauty of her surroundings reinforced her determination to claim this place as her own. Reed joined her after completing his security checks, sitting at a respectful distance. "Hayes thinks Hargrove will make his move soon," he said without preamble, "likely attempting to use Boston authorities to force your return east." "He has no legal right to do so," Josephine replied. "I'm of age and sound mind. No court would compel me to return. Territory courts aren't always bound by strict legal interpretations," Reed reminded her, "especially when influential men like Preston are involved." Silence fell between them again. Finally, Reed spoke, his voice uncharacteristically hesitant. "About what I suggested earlier, was it merely a tactical suggestion?" Josephine interrupted, needing to understand his intentions. "A legal strategy and nothing more?" Reed's gaze remained fixed on the horizon as he considered his response. "No," he finally admitted, "not merely tactical, though the legal advantages are real." "Then what?" she pressed. He turned to face her then, his expression more open than she had ever seen it. "I've spent my life moving through territories, hunting men who destroy what others build. Never stayed in one place long enough to consider—" He paused, searching for words, deeper connections. "And now," Josephine asked softly, "now I find myself thinking about what comes after Isaiah Blackwell, after the next warrant and the next hunt." His grey eyes held hers steadily. "For the first time, I'm considering a different path. Because of you." The simple declaration, coming from a man so sparing with words, carried profound weight. Josephine realized that for Reed, this was as close to a declaration of feeling as his reserved. "Nature would allow. I don't need rescuing, Nathaniel," she said carefully. "If we were to consider such an arrangement, it would need to be a true partnership, not a protective measure." "Never thought otherwise," he replied. "You've proven your strength since the moment you decided to stay in the territory rather than retreating east. Any man who sees you as needing rescue isn't seeing you clearly." The acknowledgement of her independence meant more than flowery declarations might have. This man understood her fundamental need for self-determination because he valued the same equality in himself. "We've known each other barely 2 weeks," Josephine observed, though the objection sounded hollow even to her own ears. Time seemed to measure differently in the territory, where life's uncertainties compressed experiences that might have unfolded over months or years in more civilized settings. "Some things don't require time," Reed said simply. "Just clarity." The Distant sound of wagon wheels interrupted whatever response Josephine might have made. Reed was instantly alert, moving to a position where he could observe the approaching vehicle while remaining partially concealed. "Supply wagon from Jenkins," he confirmed after a moment. "First delivery." The practical matters of unloading supplies and organizing materials for construction provided a welcome diversion from the emotional terrain they had been navigating. By the time the wagon had been emptied and the teamsters sent on their way with instructions to return with the second load in 2 days, darkness had fallen completely. Josephine lit the lamps in the bunkhouse, the warm glow transforming the simple space into something almost homey. Reed remained outside, checking the perimeter one final time before joining her. "I'll sleep by the fire," he said, nodding toward the stone hearth where flames now crackled welcomingly. "You take the back room. Door has a lock." The careful propriety touched her. Even here, isolated from society's watching eyes, he maintained boundaries that respected her position and reputation. "Nathaniel," she said as he turned to arrange his bedroll, "I haven't given you an answer." He paused, looking back at her. "Wasn't expecting one tonight. Decision like that deserves consideration." "Nevertheless," Josephine continued, gathering her courage, "I want you to know I'm considering it seriously, not just as a legal strategy, but as a possibility." Something softened in his expression. "That's enough for now." As Josephine retired to the small back room that had once housed the ranch foreman, she found her thoughts in turmoil. The day had brought threats from multiple directions: Preston's legal maneuvers, Hargrove's arrival, the injunction against improvements to her property. Yet amidst these challenges, she had also found unexpected support in Charlotte Wilson, and most surprisingly, a potential future with Nathaniel Reed that she had never anticipated when boarding that stagecoach in Boston. Tomorrow would bring decisions that would shape her future in this territory. For tonight, she allowed herself to acknowledge the growing certainty that whatever path she chose, she would not be walking it alone. The next 3 days passed in a flurry of activity. Despite the legal injunction, Josephine and Reed focused on improvements that could be justified as necessary for habitation rather than permanent development. They repaired the bunkhouse roof, restored the garden plot near the creek, and cleared debris from the house site without beginning actual reconstruction. "We're not violating the injunction," Reed explained when Josephine expressed concern. "Making the existing structure habitable is permitted. Patterson's order specifically prevents new building, not maintenance of what remains." Additional supply wagons arrived from Jenkins Mercantile, bringing essential items Josephine had ordered in Laramie: cooking equipment, bedding, tools, and seeds for planting. Each delivery also brought news from town through the teamsters. Hargrove had been meeting regularly with Preston and Judge Patterson. The Danvers brothers had returned to Whispering Pines, subdued but still watching for Josephine. Sheriff Hayes was facing pressure from the town council regarding his interference in what Preston was characterizing as a simple property dispute. On the 4th morning, as Josephine was preparing breakfast in the bunkhouse's small kitchen area, she spotted a cloud of dust on the horizon, riders approaching from the direction of Whispering Pines. Reed was already outside, rifle in hand, as he watched their approach. "5 men," he reported when she joined him. "Preston's in the lead, Hargrove beside him." Josephine's stomach tightened at the news, but she kept her voice steady. "And the others?" "Judge Patterson. 2 men I don't recognize. Likely attorneys or witnesses." Reed's expression was grim. "Official visit. They're coming to serve papers or make a formal inspection. Then we'll receive them properly," Josephine decided, returning to the bunkhouse briefly to don her best remaining dress, a navy blue garment that, while showing signs of travel, still conveyed Eastern respectability. She pinned her hair neatly, and added a cameo brooch at her throat, the only jewelry she had brought west. If this confrontation was coming, she would face it with dignity. When the riders reached the cleared area before the bunkhouse, Reed stood beside Josephine, his presence reassuring despite the tension evident in his stance. She recognized Elias. Preston immediately, a corpulent man in his 50s with a florid complexion and the self-satisfied expression of someone accustomed to power. Beside him sat William Hargrove, as meticulously dressed as ever, despite the trail dust covering his expensive suit. His thin features registered surprise at finding Josephine so composed, clearly having expected her to appear diminished by frontier conditions. Judge Patterson was a cadaverous figure whose permanent scowl suggested chronic digestive complaints rather than judicial temperament. The remaining two men were indeed attorneys, as evidenced by their formal attire and document cases. "Miss Blackwell," Preston called without dismounting, "we've come to inspect the property pursuant to the injunction issued by Judge Patterson's in court. I trust Marshal Reed has informed you of the legal restrictions on development activities." "Indeed he has, Mr. Preston," Josephine replied coolly. "You'll find we've respected the order completely. Please, gentlemen, dismount. I've coffee. If you'd care for refreshment before your inspection." The polite offer clearly caught Preston off guard. He had anticipated confrontation, not hospitality. After a moment's hesitation, he dismounted, the others following suit. Hargrove approached Josephine directly, his smile not reaching his cold eyes. "Josephine, my dear," he said, taking her hand before she could withdraw it. "What a relief to find you safe after your impulsive departure from Boston. Your father's associates have been most concerned." "How thoughtful of them," she replied, extracting her hand from his grip. "Though as my father's legal heir and the rightful owner of his business, I would have expected them to direct their concerns to my appointed managers rather than to a former employee." Hargrove's smile tightened. "Former partner," he corrected. "As your father's closest business associate, I've naturally assumed responsibility for protecting his legacy during your absence. A responsibility that was never yours to assume." "William," Josephine countered, her voice pleasant but firm, "the documents transferring ownership to me were properly filed before my departure. My managers have full authority to conduct business in my absence." Preston interrupted, clearly impatient. "With this personal exchange, Miss Blackwell, we're here on official business concerning this property. Judge Patterson has granted me leave to inspect the premises to ensure compliance with his injunction." "Of course," Josephine gestured expansively. "Please, inspect whatever you wish. Marshal Reed and I have nothing to hide." As Preston led the judge and attorneys around the property, pointing out boundaries and water access points with the familiarity of someone who had studied the land thoroughly, Hargrove remained behind with Josephine and Reed. "I must say, I'm surprised to find you in such primitive circumstances," he observed, glancing disparagingly at the bunkhouse. "Surely you see now the folly of this Western adventure. Boston society awaits your return, and your father's business requires proper management that only I can provide." Reed's presence beside Josephine seemed to grow more imposing, though he hadn't moved or spoken. She drew strength from his silent support. "My circumstances are of my own choosing, William," she replied evenly. "As for my father's business, it's being managed precisely as he intended, under my direction, through competent individuals he personally selected." Hargrove's expression hardened. "You're being unreasonable, Josephine. A woman alone cannot possibly maintain properties and business interests across territories. It's not natural." "Miss Blackwell isn't alone," Reed stated, breaking his silence. His tone was measured but carried an unmistakable warning. "She has allies here who respect her independence and her legal rights." Hargrove assessed Reed with barely concealed disdain. "And you are Nathaniel Reed, United States Marshal, a territorial lawman. Hargrove's dismissive tone suggested he considered Reed far beneath his social standing. Well, Marshal, this is actually a private matter between Miss Blackwell and her late father's business associates. Your involvement is unnecessary and, frankly, inappropriate. Reed's grey eyes remained steady. Miss Blackwell's welfare is my concern, professional and personal. The emphasis on personal wasn't lost on Hargrove, whose expression flickered between surprise and calculation. Before he could respond, Preston and his entourage returned from their inspection. The creek access points are particularly valuable, Preston was explaining to the judge. Controls water flow to the entire eastern section of the county. Hollister understood this when he pledged the property as loan collateral. I see no evidence of prohibited improvements, Judge Patterson pronounced, addressing Josephine. However, the underlying ownership dispute remains. Until resolved at trial, this property cannot be developed beyond its current state. When might we expect this trial, Your Honor? Josephine asked. 3 weeks hence. My court convenes in Whispering, in Pines on the first Monday of each month. The judge's tone suggested he was bestowing a great favor by scheduling the matter so promptly. Preston stepped forward, his manner smoothly transitional from property inspector to banker. Miss Blackwell, given the uncertainty surrounding your claim and the considerable expense of maintaining even this modest presence on the property, I'm prepared to offer a settlement, $500 for whatever interest you may have, payable immediately. This would spare you the ordeal of a trial and provide funds for your return to Boston. The sum was insultingly low for 160 acres with valuable water rights, confirming Preston's confidence in the outcome of any trial before Judge Patterson. Josephine maintained her composure with effort. That's most considerate, Mr. Preston, but I have no intention of relinquishing my claim. I look forward to presenting my case at trial. Preston's smile thinned. As you wish, though I should mention that my associate, Mr. Hargrove, has raised serious concerns about your legal capacity to enter contracts independently, given your apparent delicate mental state following your father's death. The implication was clear and chilling. If they couldn't buy her claim, they would attempt to have her declared incompetent. A strategy that would not only invalidate her homestead filing, but potentially place her personal affairs under Hargrove's control. Before Josephine could respond, Reed stepped forward. Judge Patterson, I believe you should be aware of a significant development that impacts these proceedings. Patterson raised a bristly eyebrow. And that would be, Marshal? Reed's hand moved to rest lightly on Josephine's shoulder. A public declaration of connection that sent a clear message to everyone present. Miss Blackwell and I are to be married before the end of the month. As her husband, I would have standing to represent our joint interests in any property disputes. The announcement created precisely the impact Reed had intended. Preston's face flushed with anger, while Hargrove's expression shifted from confidence to calculation. Judge Patterson merely looked confused, clearly unprepared for this complication to what had seemed a straightforward matter. Is this true? Miss Blackwell, the judge asked, peering at her with rheumy eyes. Josephine met Reed's gaze briefly, seeing the question there despite his confident declaration. In that moment, her decision crystallized, not from fear or necessity, but from recognition of the partnership they had begun building since their first meeting. Yes, Your Honor, she confirmed, her voice steady. Marshal Reed has done me the honor of proposing, and I have accepted. We planned to make the announcement after the current legal matters were settled, but circumstances have evidently forced our hand. Preston recovered first. This is clearly a transparent attempt to circumvent proper legal proceedings, he blustered. A marriage of convenience to create procedural obstacles. My personal affairs are not subject to your judgment, Mr. Preston, Josephine replied coolly. Marshal Reed and I have shared dangers and challenges that forge stronger bonds than many. Marriages based on more conventional courtships. Hargrove stepped closer, his voice pitched for her ears alone. You can't be serious, Josephine. Throwing away your position in society, your father's legacy for this? His gaze flicked dismissively toward Reed, a scarred frontier lawman with nothing to offer but a life of hardship. He offers respect for my independence and partnership rather than control, Josephine replied, equally quietly. Something you never understood, William. My father saw it clearly, which is why he ensured I would never be forced to accept your suit. The truth of her statement registered in Hargrove's expression, the realization that Jonathan Blackwell had deliberately placed his business beyond William's reach because he had recognized the younger man's true character. Before he could respond, Judge Patterson cleared his throat. This development obviously introduces new legal considerations, he announced. The trial will proceed as scheduled, but with recognition that Marshal Reed may have standing as Miss Blackwell's husband by that time. He turned to Preston. I suggest you consult with your attorneys regarding the implications. As the visitors prepared to depart, Preston taking Hargrove aside for an intense private conversation, Sheriff Hayes appeared on the ridge above the property. He approached rapidly, his expression conveying urgency. Reed, he called as he dismounted. Trouble. Isaiah Blackwell's been spotted 10 miles north with a dozen men. Word is they're planning to hit the Franklin Ranch tonight. Reed's posture changed instantly, the protective partner replaced by the focused lawman. Franklin's place is just beyond the northern ridge, too close to be coincidence. Blackwell's never hit the same area twice, Hayes agreed grimly. Unless he had a specific reason. Josephine looked between them, understanding dawning. He knows. I'm rebuilding. Someone told him. Preston and Hargrove had gone silent, listening to this exchange with expressions that shifted from irritation to concern as they grasped the implications. Judge Patterson looked frankly alarmed. Isaiah Blackwell, the raider? He asked, his judicial authority suddenly forgotten in the face of genuine danger. Here. Not yet, Hayes replied, but likely soon. Marshal Reed and I need to warn Franklin and organize defense of his property. Reed turned to Josephine, conflict evident in his expression. I have to go. Franklin has women and children on his ranch. I know, she said simply. It's your duty. Preston seized the opportunity this crisis presented. Miss Blackwell, clearly this is no place for a woman alone. You must return to town with us, where you'll be safe until this outlaw is captured. The suggestion, while seemingly practical, would place her directly under their influence, away from the property she was determined to defend. Josephine made her decision without hesitation. Thank you for your concern, Mr. Preston, but I'll remain here. The bunkhouse is secure, and I'm capable of defending myself if necessary. She glanced toward Reed. And Marshal Reed will return once the Franklin family is safe. This is madness, Hargrove protested. You cannot stay here with raiders in the vicinity. I insist you return to town under my protection. You have no authority to insist on anything regarding Miss Blackwell, Hayes interjected, his patience clearly wearing thin. Now, gentlemen, I suggest you return to Whispering Pines immediately. The trail isn't safe after dark, especially with Blackwell's men in the area. The mention of potential danger on the road accomplished what appeals to reason had not. Preston, Hargrove, and their companions mounted quickly, the judge particularly eager to be away. As they departed, Hayes turned to Reed. I've sent word to Cheyenne for reinforcements, but they won't arrive before tomorrow at the earliest. Franklin has 6 hands, plus himself. With you and me, that's 8 against Blackwell's 12. Not good odds, Reed acknowledged grimly. But better than leaving them unwarned. He turned to Josephine. I don't like leaving you alone. I'll be fine, she assured him, though fear flickered at the edges of her determination. The bunkhouse is defendable, and I know how to use the shotgun." Reed hesitated, clearly torn between his duty as a marshal and his concern for her safety. "Bar the doors. Keep the rifle close. If you hear riders approaching, don't wait to identify them. Hide in the root cellar we discovered yesterday. There's enough cover there to remain concealed." Josephine nodded, accepting his instructions without argument. The gravity of the situation left no room for pride or independence at the expense of safety. "Be careful," she said softly, "both of you." As Reed and Hayes rode north toward the Franklin Ranch, Josephine returned to the bunkhouse, securing doors and windows as Reed had instructed. The sudden silence after the day's confrontations felt ominous rather than peaceful. She checked and loaded the Winchester rifle, placing it within easy reach as she set about preparing a simple evening meal, more from need for normalcy than actual hunger. As darkness fell, she lit a single lamp, keeping it away from windows to avoid creating a visible target. The night sounds of the territory, coyotes calling in the distance, wind through the pines, the occasional rustle of small creatures in the underbrush, took on new significance as she strained to distinguish normal wilderness noises from potential human approach. Hours passed with agonizing slowness. Josephine attempted to distract herself by reviewing Charlotte Wilson's notes on the upcoming property trial, but found her attention constantly drawn to the windows and the darkness beyond. Sometime after midnight, exhaustion finally overcame vigilance, and she dozed in the chair positioned to view both the front door and main window. A sound jolted her awake. The distinctive crack of a rifle shot in the distance, followed by several more in rapid succession. Gunfire from the direction of the Franklin Ranch. Josephine moved to the window, careful to remain concealed as she peered into the darkness. The faint glow of fire illuminated the northern horizon. The raid was underway. Heart pounding, she gathered essential items into a small pack. Documents, money, the pistol Reed had given her, a canteen of water. If Blackwell's men came this way after attacking the Franklin place, she needed to be prepared to hide or flee as circumstances dictated. Another volley of gunfire echoed across the valley, closer this time. The raiders weren't staying at the Franklin Ranch. They were moving south toward her position, retreating or pursuing. Impossible to tell in the darkness. Following Reed's instructions, Josephine extinguished the lamp and moved quietly to the trap door leading to the root cellar they had discovered beneath the bunkhouse. The small underground space had once stored vegetables and preserved goods for the ranch hands. Now it offered her best chance at remaining undetected if raiders approached. She had just closed the trapdoor above her when hoofbeats pounded into the yard, multiple riders moving at speed. Through cracks in the plank floor, she could see flickers of torchlight as the newcomers surrounded the bunkhouse. "Search it," a rough voice commanded. "Find the woman. Preston says she's worth 500 to bring in alive." Josephine's blood ran cold. This wasn't just another raid. Blackwell had been hired specifically to capture her. The connections between Preston, Hargrove, and the raiders became suddenly, terrifyingly clear. Rather than risk losing in court, even with Patterson's bias in their favor, they had arranged a simpler solution: her disappearance. Heavy boots moved across the bunkhouse floor above her head. Furniture crashed as the searchers ransacked the small building. Josephine pressed herself into the darkest corner of the root cellar, the pistol clutched in suddenly damp palms. "If they discovered the trapdoor—" "She ain't here," one of the searchers reported. "Place is empty." "Check the outbuildings," the leader ordered. Isaiah Blackwell himself, Josephine presumed. She can't have gone far without a horse. Hammond, "Cooper, start a fire. Preston wants the place burned, woman or no woman." The systematic destruction of her homestead began moments later, the crash of breaking glass, the splinter of wood, and then the crackling of flames as the bunkhouse was put to the torch. Smoke began seeping through the floorboards into the root cellar. Josephine covered her mouth with a handkerchief, fighting the urge to cough as the air grew increasingly acrid. She had to move. Within minutes, the fire would either reveal the trapdoor or consume the entire structure, including her hiding place beneath. But emerging meant facing Blackwell and his men directly. Impossible odds, even if she had been as skilled with weapons as Reed. The sound of renewed gunfire came as a shock, not from within the yard, but from the ridge to the west. Shouts of alarm rose from the raiders as they scrambled for cover. "It's Reed and the sheriff," someone yelled. They doubled back. More gunfire, disciplined, measured shots rather than wild firing. Reed and Hayes were directing their attack with precision, targeting the torchbearers first, then covering the main approach to the bunkhouse. They were outnumbered, but using the high ground and darkness to their advantage. "Blackwell!" Reed's voice carried across the yard, pitched to command attention. "Federal Marshal, you're surrounded. Lay down your weapons." Laughter answered him. Blackwell was neither intimidated nor deceived. Surrounded? By what? 2 lawmen and maybe a couple of Franklin's cowhands? "I count 4 of you at most. I've got 10 men." "You had 10, another voice corrected. Franklin himself, Josephine realized. Cooper and Hammond won't be joining the count anymore. The gunfire intensified as Blackwell's men returned fire, bullets splintering what remained of the bunkhouse. Walls. The structure was now fully engulfed, heat radiating through the floor into the root cellar. Josephine realized her time was measured in minutes before the weakened floor collapsed into her hiding place. Staying meant certain death. Emerging meant probable capture or worse. Neither option promised survival, but at least the latter offered a chance, however slim. Decision made, Josephine pushed against the trapdoor, finding it partially blocked by fallen debris. Summoning strength born of desperation, she forced it open enough to slip through, emerging into a scene of chaos. The bunkhouse blazed around her, walls beginning to collapse as the fire consumed the dry timber. Through the broken windows, she could see shadowy figures exchanging gunfire in the yard. Blackwell's men, using the outbuildings for cover, Reed and his allies firing from positions along the ridge. Using the smoke and confusion as concealment, Josephine made her way to the back door, which hung partially open on broken hinges. Beyond lay darkness and the relative safety of the creek bed, if she could reach it unseen. She paused at the threshold, gathering courage for the dash across 20 yards of open ground. A figure loomed suddenly in the doorway, a raider seeking shelter from the gunfire outside. His eyes widened in surprise at finding her there, then narrowed with recognition. "Blackwell!" he shouted. The woman, Josephine, fired. Without conscious thought, the pistol's report deafening in the confined space. The raider staggered backward, clutching his chest in shock rather than pain. She didn't wait to see if the wound was serious, pushing past him into the night. "She's running for the creek," someone yelled. "Head her off!" Bullets kicked up dirt around her feet as Josephine sprinted across the open ground, lungs burning from smoke and exertion. The creek bank lay just ahead, its shallow ravine offering cover if she could reach it. 10 yards. 5. Then she was sliding down the earthen bank into the shallow water, protected momentarily from direct fire by the natural depression. Splashing through the creek, she sought deeper shadows beneath overhanging vegetation. Behind her, the bunkhouse collapsed with a thunderous crash, sending a column of sparks into the night sky. The sudden illumination exposed her position to a raider who had worked his way along the creek bank. "Got her!" he called triumphantly, leveling his rifle. A shot rang out, but not from the raider's weapon. He crumpled to the ground as Reed materialized from the darkness, moving with the silent efficiency that had made him legendary as a tracker. "Stay down," he ordered, crouching beside her in the creek bed. "Hayes and Franklin are flanking Blackwell's position. It'll be over soon." As if to confirm his words, a volley of gunfire erupted from the far side of the property, catching the remaining raiders in a crossfire. Shouts of confusion gave way to calls for surrender as the tide of battle turned decisively. "Isaiah's making a run for it," Reed observed, tracking movement through the billowing smoke, heading for the North Ridge, alone. Josephine could see the conflict in his expression. Stay with her to ensure her safety, or pursue the outlaw he had hunted for nearly a year. "Go," she urged. "End this. I'll be safe with the others." Reed hesitated only a moment before squeezing her hand once. "Stay here until Hayes signals all clear." Then he was gone, moving through the darkness with purpose as he tracked his quarry into the hills. By dawn, it was over. 3 of Blackwell's men lay dead, including the one Josephine had shot. 4 others had surrendered and were bound securely. Under Franklin's watchful eye, the remaining raiders had fled into the night, scattering in different directions to evade pursuit. Of Isaiah Blackwell and Nathaniel Reed, there was no sign. Josephine sat wrapped in a blanket near the remains of the bunkhouse, surveying the destruction with numb detachment. Everything they had built over the past days was gone. The repaired roof, the cleaned interior, the garden plot, all reduced to ashes and trampled earth. "You're lucky to be alive," Hayes said, bringing her coffee from their hastily established camp. "When we realized Blackwell was heading here after hitting Franklin's place, we thought—" He trailed off, unwilling to voice the fears that had driven their desperate ride back to the homestead. "I followed Reed's instructions," Josephine said simply. "The root cellar saved me." Hayes nodded, his expression grave. "Smart man, Reed, always thinking ahead." His use of the past tense sent a chill through Josephine. "He'll find Blackwell," she stated with conviction she didn't entirely feel. "He'll return." "I hope you're right," Hayes replied, though doubt shadowed his features. "Isaiah knows these hills better than most. And he's cornered now, which makes him doubly dangerous." The sound of approaching riders brought both of them to alert readiness. Hayes positioning himself protectively in front of Josephine with rifle raised. The tension eased as they recognized Charlotte Wilson riding beside Ben, her brother, and the editor of the Territorial Gazette. "We came as soon as we heard," Charlotte called, dismounting quickly. Her practiced eye took in the destruction and the bound prisoners. "Blackwell?" "Reed's tracking him," Hayes replied. "No word yet." Charlotte turned to Josephine, concern evident in her expression. "Are you injured?" "No, just—" Josephine gestured at the ruins surrounding them. "Everything's gone. Again." "Not everything," Charlotte corrected firmly. "You're alive. Your claim stands. And I've brought news that might compensate somewhat for your losses." She withdrew a document from her saddlebag. "Judge Peterson in Cheyenne has reviewed your case against Preston's injunction. He's issued a federal override, citing improper procedure in Patterson's court and potential judicial bias." Hope stirred in Josephine's exhausted heart. "What does that mean exactly?" "It means Preston's challenge to your homestead claim has been dismissed at the federal level. The property is unquestionably yours, with full rights to develop it however you choose." Charlotte smiled. "Sometimes justice prevails, even in territorial courts." The news should have brought unalloyed joy, but Josephine found her thoughts, turning repeatedly to the hills, where Reed had disappeared in pursuit of Blackwell. What value was securing her claim if he never returned to share in building something on this land? As the morning progressed, Franklin departed with his men and the prisoners, transporting them to Whispering Pines for formal charges. Ben Wilson, after gathering details for what promised to be a dramatic front-page story, returned to town with promises to send supplies and workers to help rebuild. Charlotte remained with Josephine and Hayes, her legal mind already formulating strategies to counter any remaining threats from Preston or Hargrove. It was mid-afternoon when a rider appeared on the northern ridge. A single figure on horseback, silhouetted against the sky. Hayes raised his field glasses. "It's Reed," he confirmed, relief evident in his voice. "And he's got something tied across his saddle." Josephine's heart leapt as Reed guided his horse down the slope toward them. As he drew closer, she could see that the bundle across his saddle was indeed a man. Isaiah Blackwell, bound and unconscious, but apparently alive. Reed dismounted wearily, his expression grim but satisfied. A bloody bandage wrapped his left forearm, and his clothing showed signs of desperate struggle, but his eyes held the calm certainty of a man who had completed a difficult but necessary task. "Tracked him to a cave in the high country," he reported to Hayes. "He didn't surrender easily." "Never expected he would," Hayes replied, examining Blackwell's still form. "Dead?" "Alive. Barely. Took a bad fall during the fight. He'll stand trial if he survives his injuries." As Hayes secured the notorious raider, Reed turned to Josephine. His usually composed features showed something she had never seen there before: vulnerability, concern, perhaps even fear of what he might find in her expression after the night's violence. "You're safe," he said softly. The simple observation, containing volumes of relief. "Thanks to your foresight with the root cellar," she replied, stepping closer, "and your timely return." His gaze took in the destruction surrounding them: the burned bunkhouse, trampled garden, scattered supplies. "Everything can be rebuilt," he said, "as long as you're willing to try again." "More than willing," Josephine assured him. "Charlotte brought news from Cheyenne. The homestead claim has been federally confirmed. The property is secure." Relief crossed Reed's features. "That simplifies matters. Preston can't challenge it further without risking federal charges for fraud." "And Hargrove," she asked, "will he return to Boston now, after what happened here? His connection to Blackwell will be exposed during the trial. He'll distance himself as quickly as possible to avoid conspiracy charges." Reed's expression softened. "You're free of both of them, Josephine. Truly free to build whatever future you choose here." The emphasis on choice wasn't lost on her. Despite his earlier proposal and her tentative acceptance, Reed was ensuring she understood that circumstances had changed. With her claim secure and her enemies neutralized, their marriage was no longer a necessary legal strategy. He was offering her the opportunity to reconsider without obligation. Josephine studied his weather-worn features, the scar that traced from temple to jaw, the eyes that had seen too much violence yet still retained compassion, the mouth that spoke so sparingly, yet with such meaning when it did. This man had risked his life repeatedly for her safety, respected her independence when others sought to control her, and now stood ready to release her from commitment if that was her wish. In that moment, her decision crystallized with perfect clarity. "I choose a future that includes you, Nathaniel," she said simply, "not from necessity or gratitude, but because I can imagine no better partner in building something meaningful here." The reserve that habitually guarded his expression fell away, revealing genuine emotion that transformed his features. "You're certain? This won't be an easy life. Rebuilding takes time, and there will be other challenges." "I'm certain," Josephine confirmed. "Besides, I came west expecting to marry a rancher and build a life from the ground up. The circumstances have changed, but the essence of that plan remains sound." A smile, rare and transformative, lit Reed's features. "Then we'll rebuild, something better than what stood here before." As Hayes and Charlotte discreetly busied themselves with preparations to transport Blackwell to town, Reed took Josephine's, hands in his, their fingers entwined naturally, a physical manifestation of the partnership they had forged through shared dangers and challenges. "I should warn you," Reed said with uncharacteristic hesitation, "I've never been much for permanent settlements, always moving, tracking, hunting." Perhaps it's time for new patterns, Josephine suggested. For both of us. I never imagined leaving Boston, yet here I stand on Wyoming soil, planning a future I couldn't have envisioned a month ago. A future we'll build together, Reed affirmed, his voice holding the weight of promise. As the afternoon sun bathed the valley in golden light, Josephine surveyed the property that had drawn her west through deception, yet now represented genuine opportunity. The burned structures would rise again, stronger and better designed. The garden would be replanted, the creek harnessed for irrigation, the meadows filled with cattle and horses. She had come seeking a fictional husband and a ready-made life, only to find herself creating something far more authentic with a man she had met by chance in the wilderness. The mail-order bride's journey had led not to the future she had imagined, but to one infinitely more valuable for being genuinely earned and freely chosen. "Where shall we begin?" she asked, turning back to Reed with renewed purpose. His grey eyes held steady determination matched with something new, hope for a future beyond the hunt that had defined his life for so long. "We begin," he said simply, "by laying the first stone. Together. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories. Right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us."